When most people hear the phrase colonial America, they picture English towns, wooden churches, and red-coated soldiers. But the story of America begins long before any English, Spanish, or French flag was raised on this continent. For thousands of years, this land was home to hundreds of indigenous nations, each with its own history, politics, and culture. To understand colonial America, we have to begin with the world that already existed here, and then watch how the first European contacts disturbed and transformed it. Long before Europeans crossed the Atlantic, human communities had spread across North America. By the end of the last ice age, small bands of hunter-gatherers were moving through forests, plains, and coasts, following herds and seasonal plants. Over many generations, these mobile groups developed into distinct nations and cultures. Some remained mainly hunters and fishers. Others slowly shifted toward farming, especially in areas where the climate and soil were favorable. Maize, beans, and squash became staple crops in many regions, supporting larger settlements and more complex societies. In the eastern woodlands, a series of earthwork building cultures rose and fell. Among them were the Adena and Hopewell traditions, whose people built large ceremonial mounds and created long-distance trade networks that stretched across much of the continent. Centuries later, what historians now call the Mississippian culture emerged, centered in the river valleys of what is today the southeastern and midwestern United States. Cities like Cahokia, near present-day Illinois, grew into major population centers with large flat-topped mounds, plazas, and complex religious and political systems. At its height, the Mississippian world linked distant communities through trade in shell, copper, stone, and food. Farther north, in the Great Lakes and Northeast woodlands, other powerful confederacies took shape. One of the most famous, the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, united several nations in a political alliance that balanced warfare, diplomacy, and trade. These alliances were not simply loose friendships. They were governed by councils, oral laws, and long-term agreements. They also served as models of decision-making that some European observers later found striking when they arrived. In the Southwest, indigenous farmers developed irrigation systems to draw water from rivers and dry ground. The ancestors of the Pueblo peoples built multi-story dwellings of stone and adobe, some set high in cliffs. Their towns and ceremonial spaces show careful planning and adaptation to an often harsh environment. In the far west and along the Pacific Northwest coast, other nations relied heavily on the sea and rivers. Salmon runs, shellfish, and maritime trades supported dense populations. Carved wooden houses, totem poles, and elaborate ceremonies expressed local identities and spiritual beliefs. What all of these societies had in common was not a single shared culture, but a deep history on the land. Languages, religious traditions, and political systems varied widely, yet communities were tied together by trade, marriage, diplomacy, and sometimes warfare. When Europeans first arrived, they did not meet a new world. They entered an ancient, already connected world with its own rules and balances of power. The first known European visitors to North America were not Spanish conquistadors or English gentlemen, but Norse seafarers from Scandinavia. Around the end of the first millennium of the Common Era, Norse sailors sailing from Greenland pushed westward into the North Atlantic. Icelandic sagas describe voyages to a land they called Vinland, a region with forests and wild grapes somewhere in what is now northeastern North America. For a long time, historians debated how much of these stories was legend. Then, in the middle of the 20th century, archaeologists uncovered clear evidence of a Norse settlement at a place now known as El Anse aux Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland in modern Canada. Excavations showed the remains of sod-roofed buildings, an iron working site, and Norse-style artifacts. Later scientific dating confirmed that the site was used around the early 11th century of the Common Era, matching the rough timeline of the sagas. This settlement seems to have been small and short-lived, probably a base camp for exploration and resource gathering rather than a permanent colony. The presence of items such as butternuts, which do not grow in Newfoundland, suggests that Norse expeditions traveled farther south along the coast, into warmer regions where those trees thrived. The Norse were skilled sailors and traders, linking Iceland, Greenland, and these western lands. Their voyages show that Europe and North America had made contact centuries before Columbus. Still, the Norse presence did not lead to lasting European settlement. The small number of settlers, conflicts with local peoples described in the sagas, and the challenges of distance and climate likely all played a role in the decision to abandon Vinland. Once they withdrew, there is no strong evidence that their brief visits had major long-term effects on the overall balance of power among indigenous nations on the mainland. For them, life continued much as before, shaped more by local rivalries, trade, and ecology than by distant visitors from across the sea. The more transformative wave of European arrivals began in the late 15th century of the Common Era, driven by changes inside Europe itself. Kingdoms like Castile, Aragon, Portugal, England, and France were consolidating power, fighting wars, and competing fiercely for trade routes. The old land routes to Asia were expensive and contested. This created a strong incentive to find new paths to wealth, especially spices, gold, and other luxury goods. Advances in ship design and navigation made longer ocean voyages more feasible. At the same time, Christian rulers saw opportunities to spread their faith and to outflank both Muslim and rival Christian powers. It was in this context that Christopher Columbus sailed west under the flag of the Spanish crown, landing in the Caribbean at the end of the 15th century. His voyages did not reach the North American mainland that will later host the English colonies in our story, but they opened the floodgates of European exploration and conquest throughout the Americas. Within a few decades, Spanish expeditions and settlers were moving into regions that are now parts of the Caribbean, Mexico, Central America, and the southern areas of what is today the United States. French fishermen and explorers were also beginning to appear along the North Atlantic coasts, drawn first by rich cod fisheries and later by the fur trade. For indigenous peoples, these first waves of contact brought both opportunities and extreme dangers. On the one hand, European metal tools, cloth, and weapons entered existing trade networks and could be adopted into local economies. Some groups used new goods and alliances to strengthen their position against traditional rivals. On the other hand, Europeans also brought something invisible and far more deadly than iron or gunpowder: diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza. These illnesses were devastating because the peoples of the Americas had no prior exposure and therefore no inherited immunity. In many regions, disease spread ahead of direct European settlement, carried along trade routes that connected distant villages and nations. The result, over time, was a catastrophic loss of life. In some places, entire communities were wiped out or reduced to a fraction of their former numbers. This demographic collapse weakened political structures, disrupted agriculture, and created openings for European powers to insert themselves into indigenous politics as new, unpredictable players. The cause and effect chain here is crucial. European states were searching for wealth and advantage in an age of competition. That search pushed sailors and soldiers across the Atlantic. Their arrival, even in small initial numbers, brought new goods and new alliances, but it also unleashed diseases and military technologies that reshaped the balance of power. Indigenous societies were not passive victims in this process. They adapted, resisted, negotiated, and fought in different ways. But the scale and speed of change, especially through epidemic disease, created strains that no community could fully control. As European exploration turned into conquest, two crowns moved first and most aggressively into the lands that would shape the future of North America, Spain, and France. Long before English ships planted fragile beachheads on the Atlantic coast, Spanish garrisons, missions, and towns dotted the far south and southwest, while French traders and missionaries were quietly building their own network along northern rivers and forests. Understanding their rival empires explains the political map that English colonists later walked into and the choices indigenous nations had to make in a rapidly changing world. Spain's strength came from its earlier conquests farther south, especially in the Caribbean and the great empires of Mesoamerica and the Andes. From those rich centers, Spanish officials looked northward, seeing the lands they called La Florida and the far interior not as empty spaces, but as a vast, defensive frontier. This frontier was meant to shield the treasure fleets sailing from the Caribbean back to Europe and to block rival European powers before they could gain a foothold. Along the southeastern coast, Spanish commanders launched repeated expeditions to claim harbors, build forts, and curb French ambitions. In the middle of the 16th century, after a brief and shaky French Huguenot presence at Fort Caroline near the modern coast of the southeastern United States, Spanish forces under Pedro Menéndez de Avilés attacked and destroyed the French outpost. Soon after, Spain founded a permanent settlement at a place now known as St. Augustine in present-day Florida, a town that would become the oldest continuously inhabited European established community in what became the continental United States. The cause and effect was clear. French attempts to plant colonies along the southeastern coast triggered a decisive Spanish response. By wiping out Fort Caroline and securing St. Augustine, Spain signaled to other powers that it claimed not just islands in the Caribbean, but a broad sweep of mainland coastline as well. Indigenous peoples near these new Spanish posts, including the Timucua and other groups in the Florida region, suddenly found themselves drawn into a colonial rivalry they had not chosen, navigating new alliances, trade opportunities, and threats. Farther inland and to the west, Spanish expeditions moved into arid and semi-arid regions that would eventually be called New Mexico, Texas, and California. Here, Spanish strategies blended military force and religious mission. Friars, especially Franciscans, established missions near indigenous communities, aiming to convert people to Christianity and bring them into a settled, European-style way of life. Soldiers built presidios or forts to protect these missions and to project royal authority. In what is now New Mexico, this pattern led to deep tensions. Pueblo peoples, with long traditions of settled village life and complex religious ceremonies, were targeted by missionary campaigns that sought to suppress traditional beliefs, dismantle sacred practices, and impose Christian rituals. Spanish officials also demanded labor and tribute, placing heavy burdens on local communities. The combination of religious suppression, forced labor, and periodic violence created mounting resentment. This pressure finally exploded in the event now known as the Pueblo Revolt in the late 17th century. Under the leadership of figures such as Pope of the San Juan Pueblo, a broad alliance of Pueblo communities coordinated an uprising that drove Spanish settlers, soldiers, and friars out of the province for a period of years. The revolt did not happen out of nowhere. It grew from decades of coercion and cultural assault, showing that indigenous peoples could still act collectively to push back a powerful empire, at least for a time. Spain eventually re-established its rule in the region, but on somewhat different terms. Spanish authorities became more cautious about directly attacking Pueblo spiritual life, and local alliances shifted once again. The larger pattern is important. Spanish power in North America was real and often harsh, but it was never absolute. It depended on negotiations, compromises, and military calculations that took indigenous agency seriously, even when officials tried to deny it. While Spain built its network of missions and garrisons in the south and southwest, another empire was taking shape in the colder lands to the north and northeast. French ambitions in North America centered less on the immediate extraction of gold or silver and more on trade, especially the highly profitable traffic in furs. From the early 17th century onward, French explorers, traders, and missionaries worked their way along the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and eventually down the Mississippi River system, creating what would be known as New France. One of the key figures in this story was Samuel de Champlain, often called the father of New France. A skilled navigator and cartographer, Champlain helped establish a permanent French settlement at Quebec along the St. Lawrence River and fostered alliances with local indigenous nations, including the Huron-Wendat. For Champlain and other French leaders, these alliances were not optional. French numbers in North America were relatively small, and survival depended on indigenous partners who knew the land, the river routes, and the rhythms of hunting and harvesting. Cause and effect again stand out. The fur trade relied on indigenous trappers and middlemen who gathered pelts from deep within the interior and funneled them toward French trading posts. In return, indigenous communities received European goods such as metal tools, cloth, and firearms. The French presence thus intensified existing trade networks, but it also transformed them, introducing new economic pressures and military technologies into indigenous rivalries. French missionaries, especially Jesuits, followed close behind the traders. They lived among indigenous communities, learning local languages and writing detailed reports about their efforts to convert people to Christianity. Among the Huron-Wendat, for example, Jesuit missionaries established mission villages and tried to reshape daily life according to European and Christian models. These efforts were sometimes welcomed, sometimes tolerated, and sometimes resisted. For some indigenous individuals, alliance with French missionaries offered access to trade goods or protection. For others, it threatened traditional beliefs and social structures. The French approach to empire was therefore different from the Spanish pattern of heavily fortified towns and rigid missionary control, but it was still an imperial project. French officials claimed sovereignty over huge stretches of land, sometimes with little more than a ceremony on a riverbank and a wooden cross or flag planted as a symbol. Indigenous nations whose lands were being claimed were rarely consulted. They remained powerful actors in their own right, yet on European maps, their homelands appeared as parts of a distant king's domain. Rivalries among indigenous groups also became entangled with European competition. A powerful example is the conflict between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Huron-Wendat and their allies. As the fur trade grew more valuable, control over key river routes and trading partnerships became a matter of survival and advantage. In the mid-17th century, the Iroquois launched a series of campaigns against the Huron-Wendat, aimed at seizing control of the fur trade. French alignment with the Huron-Wendat pulled them into this conflict, illustrating how alliances could drag European powers into indigenous wars and, in turn, how indigenous nations could leverage European support for their own strategic goals. The outcomes were often tragic. Warfare, combined with recurring epidemics of European diseases, shattered some communities and scattered survivors into new regions. Yet once again, this was not a simple story of Europeans acting and indigenous peoples only reacting. Decision-makers from many nations weighed risks, chose allies, and tried to secure their communities in a landscape that had become far more volatile. As Spanish and French claims expanded, another crucial pattern emerged: the drawing of enormous, often vague, imperial boundaries. Spanish officials in New Spain claimed vast territories stretching from the Gulf of Mexico across the interior plains and up into what they considered the northern frontier. French officials, looking from Quebec and later from the Mississippi Valley, described an equally broad New France extending down river systems and across the Great Lakes region. On paper, these empires overlapped in dramatic ways. In reality, much of that space remained firmly under indigenous control, with only a few scattered European posts marking royal ambitions. Still, the existence of these claims mattered. When English colonists later pushed inland from the Atlantic coast, they were not entering neutral ground. They were walking into a continent already mapped, at least in European eyes, into spheres of influence. Spanish Florida and the Spanish Southwest acted as a southern fence. New France, arcing from the St. Lawrence region through the Great Lakes and eventually toward the Gulf of Mexico, created a northern and western wall. Between these imperial brackets lay the coastal and interior lands where English ventures would try to take root. The contrasting styles of Spanish and French colonization also shaped future patterns of conflict and cooperation. Spanish authorities tended to assert more direct control over indigenous labor and religious life in their core areas, especially through the mission system. This sometimes produced explosive resistance, as in the Pueblo Revolt. French officials, with fewer settlers and a more thinly spread presence, leaned heavily on trade and diplomacy. They often forged relatively flexible alliances but still sought to reshape indigenous societies through mission work and economic dependency. For indigenous nations, these differences offered both dangers and possibilities. Some groups saw value in playing one empire against another, using rivalries to secure better trade terms or to seek military support against enemies. Others tried to keep their distance from European power, though disease and shifting trade patterns made isolation increasingly difficult. No single strategy guaranteed safety, and every choice had long-term consequences. By the time England truly committed to building colonies in North America, Spain and France already had a head start. Yet England was changing fast. Its rulers, merchants, and religious groups all began to look across the Atlantic and see opportunity. Out of this mixture of ambition, fear, and hope came a series of experiments, some disastrous, one enduring. To understand how colonial America took shape, we need to follow England's path from failed attempts like Roanoke to the fragile survival of Jamestown. In the later 16th century, England was a rising but uneasy power. Spanish wealth from American silver and gold seemed to dominate Europe. English leaders worried that if they did not join the race for overseas territories, they would be left behind. At the same time, religious tensions shook the kingdom. After years of conflict between Catholics and Protestants, England under Elizabeth I took a strongly Protestant direction. Spain, loyal to Catholicism, was both a religious rival and a political threat. These tensions encouraged English rulers to search for ways to weaken Spain and enrich their own realm. One method was privateering. English captains, with official permission, attacked Spanish ships and colonies, stealing treasure and disrupting trade. Another method was colonization. If England could create its own bases in the Americas, it could challenge Spanish claims, support privateers, and perhaps tap into new sources of wealth. Early promoters of colonization, such as Sir Humphrey Gilbert and Sir Walter Raleigh, argued that North America could become a place of profit and power. They imagined rich mines, fertile lands, and new markets for English goods. They also saw colonization as a solution for social problems at home. England's population was growing, and many people struggled with poverty and unemployment. Some writers claimed that sending poor or idle people to new colonies could relieve pressure at home while building overseas strength. Out of these ideas came the first serious English attempt to plant a colony in the region then called Virginia, a broad name for much of the eastern coast. In the 1880s, under Raleigh's direction, small groups of settlers tried to establish themselves on Roanoke Island, near the coast of what is now North Carolina. One group returned to England. A second group, including families, was left to build a more lasting community. When English supply ships returned after a delay of several years, they found the settlement deserted. The word Croatoan was carved on a post, suggesting a move toward a nearby indigenous community or island. But there were no clear signs of what had happened. The fate of the so-called lost colony remains uncertain. Disease, hunger, conflict with local peoples, or attempts to relocate may all have played a role. The failure of Roanoke taught English planners several hard lessons. Colonies could not be treated as quick, easy ventures left to fend for themselves. Distance, storms, and war made supply lines fragile. Settlers needed reliable support, careful planning, and stronger backing than a single nobleman could provide. It would take time for these lessons to sink in, but they shaped later strategies. While Roanoke faded into mystery, English interest in North America did not disappear. In the early 17th century, a new model of colonization emerged, the joint stock company. Instead of relying on the personal fortune of one patron, these companies pooled money from many investors. In exchange, investors received shares, hoping for profits if the colony succeeded. This approach spread both risk and potential reward. It also made colonization feel more like a business venture, grounded in calculation rather than pure adventure. One of the most important of these new corporations was the Virginia Company of London. Granted a royal charter by King James, the company received rights to settle and govern parts of North America in the king's name. The charter laid out legal authority, territorial claims, and certain rights for colonists, at least in theory. In practice, the company aimed to find a way to make money, whether through precious metals, trade routes, or valuable exports. In the spring of the year often written as 1607, 3 small ships crossed the Atlantic under the company's direction. After a long and difficult voyage, the colonists sailed up a river they named the James in honor of the king, and selected a site on a marshy peninsula to build their settlement. They called it Jamestown. This was not the first English attempt at a colony, but it would become the first to endure, though only barely at first. The company's instructions to the settlers reveal the blend of hope and fear driving the project. They were told to choose a defensible site, to watch for Spanish ships, to look for potential trade with indigenous peoples, and above all, to search for valuable resources. Many of the original colonists were not farmers or artisans, but gentlemen, soldiers, and men more accustomed to command than to hard labor. They arrived in a land whose climate, diseases, and ecology they did not understand, surrounded by indigenous nations with their own interests and histories. Jamestown's location, chosen for defense, came with serious drawbacks. The marshy ground bred mosquitoes and sickness. The brackish water was often unsafe to drink. Food supplies were limited, and the settlers lacked both the experience and the unity to organize effective farming in the new environment. Early accounts describe periods when men spent more time searching for imagined gold than planting crops. The human cost was immediate. Disease, hunger, and exposure killed many of the settlers within the first months. Leadership was unstable, with quarrels among company officers and shifting councils. One figure who stands out in these troubled beginnings is John Smith, a soldier of fortune whose writings, though self-promoting, provide vivid detail. Smith insisted that everyone should work for the good of the colony and pushed for more practical efforts in farming and building. His famous rule that those who did not work would not eat captured the desperation of the situation as much as any firm policy. Beyond the palisade walls of Jamestown stretched the territory of the Powhatan Confederacy, a network of related Algonquian-speaking peoples led by the paramount chief Wahunsenacaf, whom the English called Powhatan. The English were not entering empty land. They were inserting themselves into a complex political landscape. Powhatan controlled a number of tributary communities, managing trade, diplomacy, and war in the region. For Powhatan and his people, the arrival of the English was both a threat and an opportunity. On one hand, these strangers claimed land, cut timber, and sometimes took food without proper exchange. On the other, they brought metal tools, copper, and weapons that could be useful in local rivalries. At times, Powhatan provided food to the struggling English, perhaps seeing them as potential allies or clients. At other times, hostility grew, leading to raids and violent encounters. The famous story of Pocahontas, Powhatan's daughter, offering herself to save John Smith from execution, appears in Smith's later writings and has been heavily romanticized in popular culture. Historians debate its accuracy and meaning. What is clearer is that Pocahontas did play some role in communication between the English and Powhatan's people, appearing in English accounts as a figure who brought messages or food. Later, she would be taken captive by the English, converted to Christianity, married to the colonist John Rolfe, and brought to England, where she became a symbol of supposed harmony between the two peoples. Her actual life, however, reveals the unequal power and cultural pressures at work in the early colonial period. As Jamestown struggled through its first years, the Virginia Company continued to send new settlers and supplies. The company's leaders in London pressed for returns on their investment, but the colony produced little wealth at first. Instead, it demanded constant rescue. This tension between economic expectation and harsh reality shaped policy. Some periods saw attempts at strict discipline and near military rule. Others involved promises of land and opportunity to attract more migrants. One of the darkest moments in Jamestown's early history is remembered as the starving time. During a particularly harsh winter, after conflicts had reduced trade and cooperation with Powhatan's people, food ran desperately short. Contemporary accounts describe colonists eating horses, then dogs, and finally resorting to far more desperate measures, including evidence of cannibalism. Only a fraction of the population survived to see the arrival of new supplies and settlers in the spring. The colony came close to collapse, and at one point, the survivors actually boarded ships to abandon the settlement, only to be turned back by a new governor arriving with reinforcements. These events show how fragile early English colonization really was. Jamestown did not simply grow smoothly into a thriving town. It staggered from crisis to crisis, held together by continued investment from the company and by the strategic decisions of indigenous leaders who sometimes chose to tolerate, sometimes to resist the English presence. If either of these supports had fully broken, Jamestown might have joined Roanoke as another failed experiment. Over time, however, patterns began to shift. The company realized that it would not find easy gold or a quick passage to Asia. Instead, profit would have to come from using the land itself. This meant encouraging more permanent settlement, including families, and building an economy based on export crops. The grant of land to individual colonists or groups, rather than strict company control over all property, became more important as a way to motivate people to stay and work. When Jamestown finally moved beyond the edge of collapse, it did not become a prosperous town because of gold mines or exotic treasures. Its survival and later success rested on something far more ordinary and dangerous: a leaf. Tobacco turned the struggling Virginia settlement into the center of a land-hungry, labor-hungry plantation society. Around this crop, a distinctive Chesapeake world took shape, linking wealth, power, and race in ways that would shape all of colonial America. The key change was not the mere discovery that tobacco could grow in Virginia. Indigenous peoples in the region had long cultivated and used varieties of tobacco in religious and social life. What colonists did was develop a strain and a style of curing that suited European tastes and could be sold on a large scale. Once planters realized that they could ship tobacco to England and find a ready market, the goals of settlement shifted. Survival was still important, but profit now stood just as high. Tobacco demanded a great deal from both land and people. The plant drained nutrients from the soil, so fields could not be used for tobacco year after year without losing productivity. Planters needed fresh ground, often clearing forests along rivers and creeks where the soil was rich and transport by boat was easy. This created an almost constant push outward from the original fortified settlement into the surrounding countryside. As small clearings spread into larger plantations, the landscape began to look less like a defensive outpost and more like a patchwork of farms and estates strung out along waterways. This expansion had direct consequences for indigenous nations living nearby. As English settlers claimed more acreage for tobacco and corn, they encroached on hunting grounds, village sites, and sacred places. Agreements and truces might set out boundaries for a time, but the pressure for land never truly eased. For colonial leaders, unused or lightly used land, as they imagined it, seemed like waste. For indigenous communities, those same spaces formed part of a larger pattern of seasonal and spiritual life. These two ways of understanding the land collided again and again. Inside the colony, the rapid growth of tobacco planting raised another urgent problem: labor. Tobacco was a labor-intensive crop. Fields had to be cleared, fenced, planted, weeded, harvested, and carefully cured. For ambitious planters, the challenge was not finding a market but finding enough hands to do the work. The small number of colonists who had come as shareholders or officials could not possibly manage large tracts on their own. In these early decades, the main answer was neither machinery nor enslaved Africans, but a group of people known as indentured servants. Many of them were poor men and women from England, Ireland, and other parts of the British Isles. They agreed to sign a contract, or indenture, binding them to work for a master in the colony for a fixed number of years, often in exchange for passage across the ocean, basic support, and the promise of some reward at the end of their term, perhaps clothing, tools, or a small piece of land. From the viewpoint of colonial elites, this system had two advantages. It supplied desperately needed labor, and it allowed them to imagine that the colony was still a place of opportunity. An indentured servant might endure years of hard work and strict discipline, but in theory, freedom waited at the end. For many servants, especially those who survived disease and harsh treatment, that hope was real, even if it was often disappointed. To encourage investment in land and people, colonial authorities and company leaders developed policies that linked immigration to property. One of the most important was the so-called headright system. Under this arrangement, anyone who paid for the passage of a laborer or other migrant to Virginia could claim a grant of land, often a set number of acres per transported person. That meant that wealthy individuals who sponsored several servants could steadily build up large estates along rivers and creeks. Land, labor, and political influence began to intertwine. Over time, this created a sharp contrast within the colony. On one side stood a growing class of large planters with riverfront estates, control over many servants, and increasing say in local government. On the other side stood small farmers, landless freemen who had completed indentures but found little good land left near the coast, and servants still bound to their contracts. Even at this stage, Virginia was not a simple land of broad equality. An early form of a class system was taking shape, resting on who controlled land and workers. While Virginia was moving in this direction, another Chesapeake colony entered the picture, Maryland. Founded under the leadership of Cecilius Calvert, also known as Lord Baltimore, Maryland's charter granted it to the Calvert family as a proprietary colony. This meant that, in law, the Calverts enjoyed almost princely authority within their territory, though still under the English crown. Maryland was also intended as a refuge for English Catholics, who faced discrimination and periods of persecution at home. In practice, the colony included Protestants and Catholics, with tension and compromise shaping its politics. Economically, however, Maryland quickly resembled its neighbor. Its soils and climate suited tobacco, its rivers offered routes for shipping, and its leaders used similar strategies of land grants and labor importation. Together, Virginia and Maryland formed the core of the Chesapeake region, linked by the tobacco trade and by shared patterns of settlement and social order. At this stage, the line between different kinds of unfree labor in the Chesapeake was still more fluid than it would later become. Alongside English and Irish indentured servants, there were also Africans working in the colonies. Some were treated as lifelong slaves, others were held as servants for long terms, and at least a few gained freedom and even acquired land. Court records and scattered references show a range of statuses, from enslaved laborers to free black property holders who participated in local economic life. Yet beneath this surface variety, important changes were already underway. Planters had strong reasons to prefer workers who could be compelled to labor for a lifetime, and whose children would also be bound. Indentured servants, once free, might compete for land and resent their former masters. European wars and changing conditions in England could also reduce the number of poor migrants willing to sign indentures. Africans, brought by force through the Atlantic slave trade, offered a different source of labor, one that colonial elites increasingly tried to lock into a permanent, hereditary system of slavery. Law became a crucial tool in this shift. Over several decades, the colonial assemblies in Virginia and Maryland passed a series of statutes that narrowed the possibilities for Africans and their descendants. These laws made it clear that status as a slave flowed through the mother, ensuring that children born to enslaved women would also be enslaved. They restricted the rights of black people, whether enslaved or free, to bear arms, testify against white persons, or gather freely. Christianity, which had once been seen by some as a path that might lead to freedom, was redefined in the law so that conversion did not alter an enslaved person's status. The effect was to harden the boundaries of race and bondage. What had once been a somewhat mixed system of unfree labor, in which poor Europeans and Africans shared some similar hardships, increasingly became a racialized system in which blackness was closely linked to permanent enslavement. White servants might still face brutal conditions, but they could look forward to eventual freedom. Enslaved Africans and African Americans were trapped in a structure that offered no such release. Tensions within the white population did not vanish, however. As more former servants completed their terms, some found that the best lands near the coast and along the main rivers were controlled by entrenched planters. These newcomers often had to push into more marginal, inland areas, closer to territories still claimed by indigenous peoples and farther from the centers of trade and power. They were vulnerable to conflicts on the frontier and felt neglected by colonial governments that seemed more concerned with the interests of wealthy landowners. One dramatic eruption of these tensions came in Virginia in the later 17th century, in an uprising commonly known as Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon, a member of the colonial elite but outside the innermost circle of power, became a focal point for settlers frustrated with Governor William Berkeley's leadership. These settlers were angry about limitations on expansion, conflicts with indigenous groups, and a sense that the governor and his allies cared more about their own profits than about frontier security. Under Bacon's leadership, rebels attacked indigenous communities, some of which had not posed a direct threat, and then turned their anger against the colonial government itself. At one point, they even burned parts of Jamestown. The rebellion eventually collapsed after Bacon's death and the arrival of English troops, but it left deep marks on Virginia's ruling class. They saw clearly how quickly discontented white settlers and servants could turn their weapons not only against indigenous peoples, but against colonial authorities. In the aftermath, there is evidence that Virginia's leaders worked deliberately to tighten racial divisions. By offering small but meaningful advantages to poor whites and by further restricting the rights of Africans and African Americans, they encouraged a sense of shared whiteness that cut across class lines. This strategy did not erase economic inequality, but it helped redirect anger that might have been aimed at elites toward racialized control over black labor. Thus, out of tobacco fields and power struggles emerged a Chesapeake society with several defining features. Land was the key measure of wealth, and large tracts were increasingly concentrated in the hands of a planter elite. Labor was organized through a mixture of indentured servitude and more, race-based slavery. Political influence rested heavily with landowners who sat in colonial assemblies, managed local courts, and controlled the institutions that wrote and enforced the laws. This system tied the Chesapeake tightly into an Atlantic economy. Tobacco flowed out in ships bound for English ports, where it was taxed, traded, and consumed. Manufactured goods, tools, and some luxury items flowed back in. At the same time, though less visible in everyday colonial politics, slave ships carried human beings from the African coast to plantations in the Americas, including the Chesapeake. The region was not an isolated frontier, but part of a larger web of exchange linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Within this world, daily life varied sharply depending on one's position. Great planters lived in substantial houses along rivers, measured their wealth in acres and human property, and saw themselves as a natural leadership class. Smaller farmers and former servants struggled to maintain their independence, often working marginal lands and living with the constant risk of crop failure or debt. Enslaved men, women, and children endured forced labor, family separation, physical punishment, and legal systems designed to deny their humanity, even as they found ways to build communities, preserve elements of African culture, and resist in small and large ways. When we move from the tidewater rivers of the Chesapeake to the rocky shores of New England, we enter a very different colonial world. Here, the driving force was not a single cash crop, but a powerful religious vision. The people who crossed the Atlantic to settle in New England were not just looking for land or profit. Many of them believed they were on a sacred mission, building what one of their leaders famously called a city on a hill, a godly community that the world would watch. To understand that vision, we have to look back to the religious struggles inside England. During the later 16th and early 17th centuries, England was officially a Protestant kingdom, but many believers felt that the Church of England had not broken far enough from Catholic practices. These reformers, often called Puritans, wanted a plainer style of worship and a stricter moral life. They pushed for changes in church government and in daily behavior, hoping to purify the church from within. Not all reformers agreed on how to do this. Some believed they should stay inside the Church of England and keep arguing for further reform. Others concluded that the church was too corrupted to be fixed. They chose to separate from it entirely, forming their own small congregations. This group, known as separatists, faced serious pressure and legal danger in England, where refusing to attend the official church could bring fines, harassment, or worse. One community of separatists eventually made the decision to leave not just the national church, but the country itself. After a period of exile in the Dutch city of Leiden, they arranged passage to North America. Their journey would lead them to a place they named Plymouth, on the shore of what they still called New England. These travelers are remembered today as the Pilgrims. Their voyage did not go as planned. Storms and navigational problems pushed them north of the land they had originally targeted. When they finally made landfall, they were outside the direct authority of the company that had sponsored their journey. This raised a serious question. Under what rules and leadership would their new community operate? The response became one of the most famous moments in New England's early history. Before stepping on shore in the new land, a group of the settlers signed a short agreement known today as the Mayflower Compact. In plain language, they promised to form a civil body politic, to create and follow laws for the good of the colony, and to obey the leaders chosen under those laws. It was not a declaration of democracy in the modern sense, but it did show a strong commitment to self-government rooted in mutual promises. In this way, their religious ideas about covenant or binding agreements shaped their political life. The first years at Plymouth were harsh. The settlers arrived late in the year, in a climate they did not fully understand, with limited supplies. Many died from disease and exposure during the first winter. Survival depended heavily on the assistance of local indigenous peoples, including the Wampanoag. Figures like Tisquantum, often called Squanto, who had learned English after earlier contact and captivity, played a key role in guiding the newcomers in planting, fishing, and local survival. Cooperation and tension existed side by side, but without this early help, the Plymouth colony might well have failed. While the Pilgrims at Plymouth were struggling to stay alive, a much larger movement was forming among the non-separating Puritans, those who still considered themselves part of the Church of England but who were deeply dissatisfied. Political pressures and fears of growing repression convinced some Puritan leaders that they could not achieve their goals at home. Instead, they decided to carry their hopes across the ocean. Under a royal charter, a group of Puritan investors and leaders organized the Massachusetts Bay Company and planned a large-scale migration to New England. Unlike many earlier colonial ventures, this was not simply a scattering of individual adventurers or laborers. It included whole families, ministers, and educated leaders, all intent on building a stable, godly society. One of the most important figures in this movement was John Winthrop, who would become governor of the new colony. Before sailing, he preached a sermon that has since become central to how people remember early New England. In it, he described the Puritan project as an effort to create a city upon a hill, a model community watched by the world. If they were faithful, he believed, their society would show others what a truly Christian commonwealth could look like. If they failed, their sins would be visible to all. This idea of the colony as a moral example shaped the institutions and daily life of Massachusetts Bay. The Puritans did not come to New England seeking religious freedom for everyone. They came to build a community where their own understanding of true religion could guide law, worship, and behavior. Church membership and civic life were closely linked. In many towns, only male church members could vote in elections or hold office in the colony's governing body, the General Court. Ministers did not usually hold formal government positions, but their influence was powerful. At the local level, New England society organized itself around towns rather than scattered plantations. Groups of families would settle together near a meeting house, which served both as a church and as a place for town meetings. Land was divided among households, often with common fields or shared resources. This pattern encouraged close community ties, mutual oversight, and collective decision-making. Town meetings allowed male inhabitants to discuss local issues, levy taxes, and make choices about schools, roads, and defenses. Because the climate and soil in New England did not favor large-scale cash crops like tobacco, most families practiced mixed farming. They grew grains and vegetables, kept livestock, and sometimes added small trades or coastal fishing to their economic life. Trade with England and the West Indies still mattered, but the society was less dominated by a single export. This helped reinforce a relatively broad distribution of land among smallholders, at least in the early generations, though differences in wealth still existed. Education held a special place in the Puritan vision. They believed that all believers should be able to read the Bible for themselves. This conviction led to efforts to promote literacy and schooling. Laws in Massachusetts and neighboring colonies encouraged or required towns of a certain size to support schools. Over time, institutions of higher learning were established to train ministers and leaders. In this way, the religious emphasis on Scripture produced a culture that valued reading and learning more generally. Family life in New England also reflected Puritan beliefs. Marriage was seen as a solemn but civil contract, often recorded by local magistrates rather than treated purely as a church sacrament. Husbands were expected to lead households, but wives were considered partners in managing family farms, raising children, and participating in the congregation's spiritual life. Large families were common, both because of religious ideals and because children's labor was important in a farming economy. Compared to some other regions, New England's climate and social structure supported more stable family units and somewhat longer life expectancy, though disease and hardship were never absent. At the same time, this society could be harsh toward those who did not fit its norms. The same commitment to a shared moral vision that held towns together also made them suspicious of dissent. Blasphemy, sexual misconduct, drunkenness, and public disrespect of authority could all bring fines, public shaming, or worse. Women and men who challenged the religious or political leadership directly could find themselves banished, imprisoned, or even executed in extreme cases, such as the persecution of Quakers later in the century. The most famous episodes of dissent in early Massachusetts involve figures like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. Both were deeply religious, intelligent, and committed believers. Yet they came to different conclusions than the colony's leaders about key questions. Roger Williams argued for a clearer separation between church and civil government and for more just treatment of indigenous peoples, including respect for their land rights. Anne Hutchinson led religious meetings in which she offered interpretations of grace and assurance that alarmed ministers. The authorities saw both as threats to the unity and order of the community. Eventually, each was banished, and their followers helped form new settlements outside Massachusetts Bay. These conflicts show that even in a society built on shared faith, sharp disagreements and power struggles were present. The ideal of a unified city on a hill was difficult to maintain in practice. Human ambition, fear, and conscience pulled people in different directions. Yet even as some individuals left or were forced out, the basic structure of Puritan town and church life remained strong in much of New England. Relations with indigenous peoples in New England took on their own particular shape. Early moments of cooperation, such as the alliances that helped the Plymouth settlement survive, gave way over time to deeper competition for land and resources. English settlers did not usually seek to enslave indigenous people on a large scale in this region, but their expanding farms and towns steadily pushed into territories long used by native nations. Missionary efforts to convert indigenous communities to Christianity also added another layer of tension as they attempted to reshape traditional beliefs and social patterns. From the English perspective, New England was a place to build a disciplined, godly society of small towns, family farms, and close-knit congregations. From the vantage point of indigenous nations, it was another front in the larger story of European encroachment, disease, and cultural disruption. As generations passed, conflicts over land, sovereignty, and religious influence would lead to brutal wars that reshaped the region. The promise of New England as a city on a hill carried within it a quiet tension. On one hand, Puritan leaders believed they were building a godly commonwealth based on shared faith and moral order. On the other hand, that same conviction left little room for people who heard God's voice differently or questioned the authority of ministers and magistrates. As those tensions grew, they pushed some colonists to the edge of the community and finally beyond it, while relations with indigenous nations slid from uneasy coexistence into open war. Out of conscience and conflict, new colonies took shape, and New England itself was transformed. One of the most important figures in this story is Roger Williams, a minister whose ideas challenged the foundation of Massachusetts Bay's religious and political structure. Williams was deeply devout, but he came to believe that true faith could not be enforced by civil authorities. In his view, church and state should be clearly separated, and the magistrates of a commonwealth should not punish people for religious errors. He also argued that the English king had no right to grant native lands to colonists without first purchasing them fairly from indigenous owners. These views struck at the heart of Puritan assumptions. For the leaders of Massachusetts, the colony's charter and their own interpretation of Scripture justified both their political power and their land claims. Williams's insistence that the king's patent could not erase indigenous rights made them uneasy. His demand for a sharp wall between church and state also threatened the close alliance between ministers and magistrates that held their society together. At first, authorities tried to silence or contain him, but Williams did not back down. Eventually, the General Court of Massachusetts declared his opinions dangerous and ordered him banished. In the dead of winter, he slipped away from the colony, traveling through snow and wilderness. Indigenous allies, including members of the Narragansett Nation, helped him survive and find a place where he could begin again. There, on land he claimed to have purchased from local native leaders, Williams founded a settlement he called Providence. From the beginning, he laid out principles very different from those of Massachusetts. Providence would be a place where no one would be punished by the government for their religious beliefs, so long as they did not disturb civil peace. Over time, other nearby settlements formed under similar ideas, including communities of Baptists, Quakers, and other dissenters. These towns would eventually join together under a charter as the colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. Rhode Island became a kind of safety valve for New England, a place where people who could not live under the strict orthodoxy of Massachusetts might find refuge. Its existence showed that another model of colonial society was possible, one in which the state did not enforce a single religious vision. To many in Massachusetts, however, Rhode Island looked like a dangerous experiment, a patchwork of heretics that could undermine the moral fabric of the region. Another powerful challenge came from Anne Hutchinson, a midwife and lay religious leader in Massachusetts Bay. Hutchinson held meetings in her home, attended by men and women, where she discussed sermons and offered her own interpretations of grace and salvation. She emphasized the idea that true assurance of God's favor came from an inward experience of grace, not from outward obedience to moral laws or the judgments of ministers. For Puritan leaders, Hutchinson's teachings raised alarms. They feared that stressing inner assurance could weaken the authority of ministers and encourage people to ignore moral discipline. They were also deeply unsettled by her boldness as a woman speaking publicly about theology in a male-dominated society. As her following grew, her critics accused her of claiming special revelations from God and of sowing division in the colony. The government brought Hutchinson to trial, questioning her for days. The proceedings revealed not only doctrinal disputes but also anxieties about gender, authority, and order. In the end, the court judged her teachings to be dangerous and banished her from the colony. She and many of her supporters relocated southward, joining others in what would become Rhode Island, and also moving into regions along what later became the borderlands of New Netherland. These episodes of banishment and migration were not mere footnotes. They showed how the unity of the Puritan project depended on constant boundary making, drawing lines around acceptable belief and behavior. When conscience led individuals beyond those lines, the colony chose exclusion over accommodation. Yet those exclusions did not silence dissent. They scattered it into new spaces where different kinds of colonial societies began to take root. While conflicts over religious conscience reshaped the map of New England, another, more violent set of conflicts reshaped its relations with indigenous nations. In the early years of settlement, English colonists had relied heavily on native allies for survival and trade. Over time, however, growing numbers of towns, farms, and livestock pressed against native territories. Misunderstandings over land sales, grazing animals, and legal jurisdiction multiplied. One of the first large-scale wars between New England colonists and an indigenous nation was the Pequot War. The Pequot were a powerful people in the region that is now southern New England, controlling trade routes and interacting with Dutch and English traders. As English settlements expanded in the Connecticut River Valley, tensions grew over trade, alliances, and accusations of violence on both sides. English colonists sought to weaken Pequot influence and secure their own position in the region. The conflict that followed was brutal. English forces, joined by native allies such as the Narragansett and Mohegan, launched attacks on Pequot villages. The most infamous episode occurred when colonial soldiers surrounded a Pequot fort, set it on fire, and killed many who tried to escape. The massacre shocked even some of the native allies, who had not expected such complete destruction of non-combatants. By the end of the war, Pequot survivors were killed, enslaved, or forced into other communities. The Pequot, as a distinct, independent power in the region, were effectively destroyed. The causes of the Pequot War lay in competition for trade and land, but its effect reached further. It set a precedent for extreme violence against indigenous communities and for alliances in which some native nations joined colonial forces against others to protect their own interests. It also opened more territory for English settlement in the Connecticut River Valley and surrounding areas, reinforcing the sense among colonists that God favored their expansion. After the Pequot War, English settlements continued to spread. Towns grew in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and along the coast of what would become New Hampshire and Maine. Colonial governments negotiated treaties, purchased land under terms they considered legal, and also simply occupied spaces they believed were underused. For indigenous nations, these encroachments gradually restricted hunting grounds, disrupted traditional patterns of life, and increased dependence on trade with the English. At the same time, Christian missionary work among indigenous people in New England expanded. Some native individuals and communities converted to Christianity and formed what colonists called praying towns, where they adopted many aspects of English-style agriculture, dress, and worship. These communities sometimes hoped that conversion and cooperation would offer protection in a colonial world they could not avoid. Others remained committed to their own religious traditions and political independence. By the later part of the 17th century, strains between English colonists and many indigenous nations had reached a breaking point. One of the central figures in the next great conflict was Metacom, a Wampanoag leader the English called King Philip. His father, Massasoit, had once made an alliance with the Plymouth settlers that helped them survive their early hardships. Over the decades, however, that alliance had been pulled apart by land loss, legal disputes, and cultural pressure. Metacom watched as English towns multiplied, fences and pastures cut across the land, and colonial courts assumed more power over native people. The sale of land, sometimes under heavy pressure or in the shadow of debt, reduced Wampanoag territory. English missionaries and officials demanded that native people follow colonial laws, even in matters that had long been governed by their own leaders. For many indigenous communities in southern New England, it seemed that their autonomy was being steadily stripped away. Tensions turned to war after a series of incidents, including the execution by colonists of 3 Wampanoag men accused of killing a native Christian who had acted as an informer. To Metacom and others, this looked like proof that English courts would not respect native authority or fairness. In the conflict that followed, known to the English as King Philip's War. A broad alliance of indigenous nations launched coordinated attacks on English towns across New England. The war was devastating on both sides. Native warriors burned settlements, killed colonists, and forced many communities to flee to safer strongholds. Colonial militias responded with their own campaigns, destroying native villages, killing non-combatants, and sending captives into slavery in the Caribbean and elsewhere. Praying Indian communities, despite their conversion, often found themselves distrusted by both sides, some being disarmed or removed by colonial suspicion, others being targeted by native fighters who saw them as collaborators. In terms of proportion to the population, King Philip's War was one of the most destructive conflicts in early American history. Many English towns were damaged or abandoned, and the colonial economy suffered. For indigenous nations, the losses were even more severe. Death from battle, execution, starvation, and disease, combined with the enslavement and forced removal of survivors. The war effectively broke the military strength of many native groups in southern New England and opened the way for more rapid English expansion. The end of the war did not erase native presence from New England, but it shifted the balance of power heavily toward the colonists. English authorities tightened their control over land, imposed new restrictions on indigenous communities, and expanded settlements into areas that had been contested. For colonists, the war reinforced a sense of vulnerability and a belief that their survival required strong defenses and firm oversight of native peoples. For indigenous survivors, it meant adapting to a world increasingly dominated by English law and land claims, while holding on to identity and tradition as best they could. As English America grew, a third great region emerged between the Puritan towns of New England and the tobacco fields of the Chesapeake. This band of colonies along the Middle Atlantic coast would become known for something different: diversity. Here, Dutch merchants, English governors, German farmers, Quaker idealists, enslaved Africans, and many others lived side by side in a complex mix. The middle colonies did not revolve around a single crop or a single church. Instead, they developed as crossroads of trade, culture, and belief. The story begins not with the English, but with the Dutch. In the early 17th century, the Dutch Republic was one of the most commercially advanced societies in Europe. Its merchants and ship owners were deeply involved in global trade, from Asian spices to Baltic timber. Seeking a share of American wealth, the Dutch founded the West India Company to compete with Spanish, Portuguese, and English ventures in the Atlantic. Explorers sailing for the Dutch probed the Atlantic coast and its rivers. One of the most important of these voyages was led by Henry Hudson, an Englishman in Dutch service, who steered his ship into the great river that now bears his name. Sailing upstream, he saw fertile shores and deep waters that could support trade and settlement. Dutch merchants soon recognized the river's potential as a highway into the interior, especially for the fur trade. To secure their claims, the Dutch established a colony they called New Netherland. At the mouth of the river, on an island that would one day be covered by Manhattan streets, they built a small commercial hub called New Amsterdam. Farther upriver, they founded posts like Fort Orange near the site of modern Albany. These settlements were not primarily religious experiments or agricultural communities. They were outposts of commerce meant to anchor Dutch influence and channel furs and other products into the Atlantic trade. New Netherlands' population was never large compared to New England or Virginia, but it was remarkably mixed. Company officials and merchants encouraged settlers from many backgrounds to come. Dutch, Walloon, German, Scandinavian, and even some Jewish settlers made their homes there. Indigenous nations, such as the Lenape along the lower river and the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy, in the interior were essential partners in trade. Fur, especially beaver pelts, traveled from native hunters and middlemen to Dutch warehouses and then across the ocean. To encourage more settlement and to reward large investors, Dutch authorities created the patroon system. Wealthy individuals who could bring a certain number of colonists at their own expense were granted large estates along the river, with certain feudal-style privileges over the land and its tenants. The result was a colony where small farmers, free traders, company officials, and great landholders all coexisted under a somewhat loose and pragmatic government. Relations with indigenous peoples in New Netherland were complex. Trade brought profit to both sides but also sparked conflict. Misunderstandings over land sales, disputes over credit, and violent incidents at times led to wars, particularly in the lower Hudson region. Still, Dutch officials often approached native diplomacy in a transactional, negotiated way, recognizing that their small numbers required cooperation as much as conquest. While the Dutch built this commercial colony, English kings looked on with growing interest and jealousy. By the middle of the 17th century, English power at sea had increased, and royal leaders were eager to tie the patchwork of their North American colonies into a more unified and profitable system. New Netherland, sitting right between New England and the Chesapeake, looked like an unwelcome wedge of foreign control. Under King Charles II, English authorities moved to change that. In a striking act of royal generosity, the king granted the lands of New Netherland to his brother, the Duke of York, even though they were still in Dutch hands. English warships sailed into the harbor of New Amsterdam and demanded surrender. Outnumbered and poorly supported by the home government, the Dutch colonial leaders accepted English rule. In return, the English largely respected existing property rights and allowed many Dutch residents to stay. New Netherland became New York, and New Amsterdam became New York City. Dutch influence did not vanish overnight. Dutch families, place names, and legal habits lingered for generations. But the colony now fit into the expanding English imperial frame. An appointed governor ruled in the name of the Duke of York, later King James II, while an increasingly mixed population of Dutch, English, and other settlers adapted to the new order. South and west of New York, further changes unfolded. Portions of the Duke's vast grant were split off to become New Jersey. This colony passed through the hands of various proprietors, some of whom offered generous terms to attract settlers, promises of land, lower taxes, and a measure of religious toleration. As a result, New Jersey developed as a patchwork of communities with differing origins, including English, Dutch, and later German and Scots-Irish migrants. Even more distinctive was the colony that would be created just to the west, Pennsylvania. Its founder, William Penn, was the son of an English admiral and a committed member of the Society of Friends, better known as Quakers. Quakers believed in the inner light, a direct, personal experience of God available to all people. They rejected elaborate church hierarchies, refused to swear oaths, and were known for their plain dress and speech. Their beliefs, including a testimony against war, often brought them into conflict with authorities in England. As payment for debts owed to his father, William Penn received a vast grant of land in North America from King Charles II. Penn saw this not only as property, but as an opportunity to create what he called a holy experiment in religious toleration and fair governance. The new colony, Pennsylvania, would welcome people of many faiths, provide a degree of self-government, and seek peaceable relations with indigenous peoples. Penn himself traveled to the new colony, planning the layout of its principal city, Philadelphia, with broad, orderly streets and public squares. He met with local native leaders, including groups of the Lenape, and negotiated agreements for land use. Later memory often turned these meetings into almost perfect symbols of harmony. In reality, while Penn's approach was more respectful than that of many other colonial leaders, the expansion of settlement still placed pressure on native lands over time. Yet for a period, Pennsylvania's policies did reduce the kind of immediate frontier warfare seen elsewhere. Politically, Pennsylvania's frame of government blended strong property rights with legal protections for liberty of conscience. The colony had an elected assembly with real powers, including control over taxation. Quakers held many offices, and their ideals influenced laws on criminal punishment, debt, and fair treatment. Religious freedom was not absolute by modern standards, but many groups enjoyed a level of toleration unusual in Europe. Quakers, Baptists, Mennonites, Lutherans, Reformed Protestants, and even, in time, small Jewish communities. Economically, the Middle Colonies developed as some of the most productive agricultural regions in English America. Their fertile soils and moderate climate made them ideal for growing grains such as wheat and rye, as well as corn and other crops. Because of this, Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey were sometimes called the bread colonies. Farmers produced surpluses that could be sold in nearby towns and exported abroad. Town life also prospered. New York City and Philadelphia grew into major ports with busy wharves, warehouses, and shops. Merchants there handled not only local grain and livestock, but also furs, timber, and imported goods. Artisans such as blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers, printers, and shipbuilders found work in these growing urban centers. The presence of printing presses supported newspapers and pamphlets that allowed political and religious debates to spread widely. Diversity was a defining trait of this world. Immigrants from German-speaking lands settled in rural Pennsylvania, bringing their own farming traditions, dialects, and religious practices. Scots-Irish migrants, many of them Presbyterians who had faced hardship in Ireland, moved into frontier zones, often forming a buffer between older settlements and native territories. Dutch families remained influential in parts of New York and New Jersey. Enslaved Africans lived and worked in the region as well, especially in cities and on larger farms, though slavery here did not usually take the same plantation form as in the Deep South. This mixture of peoples created both opportunities and tensions. On the one hand, the Middle Colonies became places where many European migrants could find land, work, and relative freedom to worship. On the other, differences in language, custom, and faith sometimes led to suspicion and conflict. Colonial governments had to learn to manage a more plural society, balancing the interests of various groups while still asserting English authority and law. Religion in the Middle Colonies lacked a single dominant establishment. The Church of England existed, especially in New York, but it did not control all public life as firmly as in some regions. Quaker meetings guided community norms in many parts of Pennsylvania, but even there, non-Quakers gained influence over time. This absence of a single religious monopoly fostered habits of compromise and coexistence, even when debates grew heated. The legal and political culture of the Middle Colonies reflected this complexity. Assemblies in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania often pushed back against royal governors and proprietors, defending their right to control taxation and shape local laws. Merchants and landowners used the language of English rights to argue their cases. At the same time, ordinary artisans and farmers sometimes leveraged the crowded urban environment to make their voices heard through protests, petitions, and boycotts. Slavery, though less central than in the plantation South, was very real in the Middle Colonies. Enslaved men and women worked in households, on farms, and in the busy streets and docks of port cities. In New York City, for example, a significant portion of the population was enslaved. They built roads, handled cargo, and served in homes. Laws restricted their movement and gatherings, and periodic scares about uprisings led to harsh punishments and tighter controls. The presence of slavery in a region celebrating religious toleration and economic opportunity highlighted the contradictions that ran through colonial society. By the time the Middle Colonies were taking shape, a larger and far darker system was tightening its grip across the Atlantic. This was the world of race-based chattel slavery, a system that treated human beings as property and turned their bodies and labor into the engine of enormous wealth. In the southern mainland colonies and the Caribbean islands, that system created a distinctive kind of society, the plantation South. To understand colonial America, we have to see how deeply it was tied to this Atlantic web of ships, markets, and coerced labor. The roots of this story lie along the coasts of West and Central Africa, where diverse kingdoms and communities had long traded with each other and with Mediterranean and Atlantic powers. European demand for labor in the Americas grew rapidly after the first waves of conquest. Indigenous populations, devastated by disease and warfare, could not supply the labor European empires wanted for mines and plantations. In response, merchants, rulers, and raiders on both sides of the ocean built a vast trade in enslaved Africans. This trade did not take a single simple form. Some African leaders, seeking weapons, goods, or political advantage, participated in raids and sales. European traders built forts and factories along the coast, exchanging textiles, metal, alcohol, and guns for captives. Inland wars and kidnappings fed a demand that seemed never to end. Each part of the system had its own logic, but the effect was the same. Millions of people forced from their homes, marched to coastal prisons, and crammed into ships bound for distant shores. The Middle Passage, the voyage across the Atlantic, became one of the most horrific experiences in human history. Captives were chained in tight spaces below deck, often unable to stand, with little air, poor food, and almost no sanitation. Disease spread quickly. Many died before reaching land. Those who survived arrived in the Americas weakened and traumatized, only to be sold again at auction blocks in Caribbean ports or on the mainland. The profits from this trade enriched European merchants, shipowners, and investors, and gradually also colonial elites who bought enslaved workers. For the mainland English colonies, especially in the South, this Atlantic slave trade became increasingly important over time. In the earlier decades of Virginia and Maryland, indentured servants from Europe had been a major labor source. But as opportunities improved in England and as planters sought more permanent control over their workers, they turned more and more to enslaved Africans. Laws hardened to make slavery hereditary and racial, binding not only those who had been taken from Africa, but their children and grandchildren. As this shift occurred, new colonies to the south were being founded with slavery built into their structures from the beginning. The colony of Carolina, originally chartered as a single vast territory, was especially shaped by connections to the Caribbean. Many of its early leading settlers came from Barbados, a small island that had become one of England's richest sugar colonies. On Barbados, enslaved African labor already formed the backbone of a brutal plantation system overseen by a small white elite. When Barbadian planters and their associates moved to the Carolina mainland, they brought with them not only enslaved people, but also an entire way of thinking about land, labor, and race. They envisioned large estates growing profitable crops for export. At first, they experimented with raising cattle, exporting beef to the Caribbean, and producing naval stores such as pitch and tar for shipbuilding. Over time, they turned more toward rice and later indigo, both of which required intense labor in difficult conditions. Rice cultivation, especially in the low country of what would later become South Carolina and Georgia, depended heavily on the knowledge and skills of enslaved Africans from regions where rice had long been grown. These workers understood how to manage fields that were flooded and drained in careful cycles, how to build dikes and canals, and how to handle the crop from planting to harvest. Planters claimed the profits, but much of the technical expertise lay with those whose backs bent in the fields. The environment of the coastal low country was harsh. Swampy lands bred mosquitoes that spread malaria and other diseases. Enslaved people often faced long hours in water and mud under a hot sun, with little protection. Mortality rates were high. Planters responded by importing more captives, turning human lives into replaceable units in their calculations. Over time, in some low country districts, the number of enslaved Africans and African Americans far exceeded that of white colonists. In such settings, culture and resistance took on distinctive forms. On some large plantations, where African-born people formed the majority, elements of African languages, music, religious practices, and family customs blended with new realities to create Creole cultures. In parts of the Carolina and Georgia coast and on nearby sea islands, communities later known as Gula or Geechee preserved particularly strong African influences in speech, crafts, and traditions. Even under constant threat of violence, enslaved people found ways to create families, nurture spirituality, and maintain a sense of identity that slavery was meant to erase. The law, meanwhile, moved steadily to reinforce the power of slaveholders. Colonial assemblies in the southern colonies passed slave codes that defined enslaved people as property, limited their movement, and punished resistance with whippings, mutilations, or death. These codes often included provisions requiring passes for travel, restricting gatherings, and authorizing patrols to search for runaways or suspected conspiracies. White colonists, including those who did not own slaves, were drawn into this system as patrol members or informants, tying racial control to broader social order. Violent resistance did occur. Individual runaways fled into forests and swamps, sometimes forming maroon communities that survived on the edges of colonial control. Occasional uprisings, such as the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, saw groups of enslaved men seize weapons and attempt to fight their way to freedom, often hoping to reach Spanish Florida, where authorities sometimes offered refuge to fugitive slaves as a way to weaken English power. Such rebellions were usually crushed with bloody reprisals, and slave codes were tightened afterward. Yet the very existence of these revolts showed that enslaved people never accepted their condition as natural or rightful. The plantation South did not exist in isolation. It was a crucial part of an Atlantic economic system often described as triangular trade. One leg of this triangle linked European ports to the African coast, carrying manufactured goods to be exchanged for captives. Another leg carried those captives westward in the Middle Passage. The third leg sent colonial products back to Europe and to other colonies. Sugar from the Caribbean, tobacco and rice from the mainland, indigo and later cotton, as well as timber and naval stores. This was not a perfectly balanced triangle in every case, but it captures a key truth. Colonial wealth was deeply entangled in slavery, not just in the South, but throughout the empire. Northern merchants in New England and the Middle Colonies built and staffed ships that carried enslaved people, invested in voyages, and insured cargoes. Rum, produced in northern distilleries from Caribbean molasses, played a role in transactions along the African coast. Goods manufactured or traded in London, Bristol, and Liverpool helped sustain the entire system. Slavery, though most visible on plantations, also flowed through counting houses and workshops far from the fields. In the southern mainland colonies, the presence of slavery shaped social structures in powerful ways. A small elite of large planters owned the greatest number of enslaved people and controlled vast tracts of land. Their wealth gave them influence in colonial assemblies, courts, and councils. They built impressive houses, imported fine goods, and saw themselves as members of a transatlantic gentry, equal in refinement to the aristocrats of England. Below them stood smaller planters and farmers who might own a few enslaved people or none at all. Many aspired to rise into the ranks of the elite, believing that with luck and effort, they too could expand their holdings. This hope linked them to the system, even when they lacked great wealth. Farther down the social ladder were poor white laborers and frontier settlers who owned no slaves and often suffered hardship, yet still benefited from racial status that placed them above enslaved Africans and their descendants. For the enslaved majority in many plantation zones, the social order offered almost no recognized rights. Families could be torn apart by sale at any time. Marriages had no legal protection. Any assertion of autonomy risked brutal punishment. And yet, in quiet and sometimes hidden ways, enslaved people carved out spaces of humanity. They told stories, sang songs, held secret religious meetings, and passed down memories. Many embraced Christianity, reshaping it to emphasize hope, deliverance, and the dignity of the oppressed. Others preserved elements of African spiritual practice, blending old and new in creative ways. Gender also shaped the experience of slavery. Enslaved women labored in fields and households, faced sexual exploitation by owners and overseers, and bore children whose status as slaves enriched their masters. Yet as mothers and caregivers, they also played central roles in preserving culture and sustaining community life. Enslaved men often faced the hardest physical labor and the harshest public punishments, but women carried burdens that were both physical and deeply personal. Over the decades, the plantation South became more firmly set in its patterns. Rice and indigo flowed out of Carolina and Georgia ports. Tobacco continued to dominate Virginia and Maryland, increasingly worked by enslaved labor rather than white servants. In all these colonies, law and custom linked racial identity to bondage, even as some free people of African descent still managed to exist in certain niches, especially in towns. The basic assumption among white colonists that Africans were naturally suited to slavery hardened into elaborate theories of racial difference, used to justify a system that brought them profit and power. Beneath the dramatic stories of voyages, wars, and plantations, colonial America was also a world of routines. People tilled fields, argued in court, went to church, bought and sold goods, married, raised children, and worried about taxes. All of this daily life unfolded inside political structures that linked the colonies to the English crown and to one another. To understand how the colonies functioned, we have to look closely at these imperial frameworks and at how ordinary people lived within them. The English colonies in North America did not all begin under the same kind of authority. Some were charter colonies, where the crown granted a formal document giving broad powers of self-government to a company or a body of settlers. Others were proprietary colonies, entrusted to individual proprietors or families who exercised almost princely rights in their territories. Still others were royal colonies, ruled more directly by the king through appointed governors. Over time, as charters were revoked or modified, more colonies drifted into the royal category, but the earlier patterns left their mark. In a typical royal colony, the king appointed a governor who served as his representative. This governor presided over an appointed council, which acted something like an upper legislative house, and also served judicial and advisory roles. Alongside these officials stood an elected assembly, chosen by eligible colonists, usually free men who met certain property requirements. The assembly had real power over taxation and local legislation, even if the governor and council could veto its acts. The constant negotiation among these three bodies shaped colonial politics. In charter and proprietary colonies, the details varied. Some had more flexible arrangements that allowed colonists greater control over offices and laws. Others still placed large powers in the hands of proprietors who, in theory, stood like landlords over vast domains. But everywhere, colonists became familiar with the idea that free men with property could elect representatives, that those representatives could debate laws and taxes, and that local institutions had a voice, even within an imperial system. At the local level, town and county governments managed the practical business of life. In New England, the town meeting was central. Male residents gathered periodically to decide on local matters, how to maintain roads, support schools, pay the minister, or care for the poor. Votes were taken openly, often by a show of hands or by calling out. This practice gave many ordinary settlers direct experience with public debate and decision-making, even if women, enslaved people, and men without property were excluded. In the Chesapeake and Southern colonies, where settlement patterns were more scattered and centered on plantations, county courts and parish vestries played a similar role. Justices of the peace, drawn from the local gentry, met to hear minor legal cases, oversee public works, and enforce social regulations. The vestry, a committee of lay leaders in the established Church of England, managed church property and local relief. These bodies were less democratic than New England town meetings, but they still depended on a degree of consent and cooperation from free white neighbors. Charters and laws framed these institutions, but they also left room for colonial adaptation. Over the decades, colonists learned to use the language of English rights to defend their interests. When governors tried to bypass assemblies or to impose taxes without consent, local leaders often protested that such measures violated the traditional liberties of Englishmen. They pointed to documents like Magna Carta and to parliamentary custom, arguing that even in America they were entitled to representation in any body that levied taxes upon them. At the same time, power in colonial society was far from equal. Property qualifications for voting and office holding meant that poorer men had limited political voice. Enslaved Africans and African Americans had none. Free women rarely held public office, and married women's legal identities were largely absorbed into those of their husbands under English common law. Indigenous peoples living within colonial boundaries seldom had recognized standing in colonial courts, except when their presence was useful to authorities. Yet the fact that political participation was limited does not mean it was meaningless. For those who could vote or serve in local roles, it created habits of expectation. Petitioning, protesting, and organizing elections became part of colonial culture. This experience would later prove important when colonists confronted imperial reforms. They were not simply subjects. They were people who had grown used to a measure of self-rule. Religion and law were tightly interwoven with these structures. In colonies where the Church of England was established, such as Virginia, South Carolina, and later parts of the Middle Colonies, parish boundaries overlapped with political ones. Taxes supported the parish church and its minister, whether or not every resident shared the same faith. Dissenting Protestants might be tolerated, but they often had to fight for the right to build their own meeting houses or to receive equal legal treatment. In New England, where Puritan congregations dominated, membership in the church could be a gateway to political participation. Rules about moral behavior, Sabbath observance, and proper dress sometimes found their way into law. Local magistrates prosecuted offenses such as drunkenness, swearing, and sexual misconduct, not only as individual sins but as threats to the harmony of the community. Even there, over time, pressures from growing diversity and from imperial authorities pushed toward greater toleration, but the ideal of a morally governed society remained strong. Everyday life under these structures varied by region, class, gender, and legal status. For a free farming family in New England, a typical year might revolve around planting and harvesting grain and vegetables, caring for livestock, attending Sunday worship, and taking part in occasional town meetings. Children were expected to contribute to household labor from an early age, fetching water, tending animals, or helping in the fields. Winter brought long nights by the fire, mending tools, spinning yarn, and reading if one had access to books. In the Middle Colonies, a German-speaking farmer outside Philadelphia might grow wheat and rye, raise pigs and cattle, and travel to town markets to sell surplus. He and his neighbors might attend a Lutheran or Reformed church, or perhaps a Mennonite meeting. News arrived through travelers and through printed newspapers, which were becoming more common. The farmer's wife would manage the household, oversee gardens, preserve food, and help with business decisions, even if the law spoke mainly in her husband's name. In the southern colonies, a small white farmer with a few acres and perhaps one or two enslaved people would live in the shadow of great planters. He might grow corn and tobacco, hunt in nearby woods, and trade occasionally in a county seat. He would look to county courts for justice and to the established church for rites of passage, even if he attended services irregularly. His sense of status would be shaped both by his limited property and by the fact that, as a white man, he stood above enslaved Africans in the social hierarchy. For enslaved people, daily life depended heavily on the kind of work they were assigned and the nature of their masters. On a Virginia tobacco plantation, enslaved men and women might work in gangs under the eye of an overseer, moving from field to plant, weed, and harvest. Punishments for disobedience could be swift and severe. At night, they returned to simple cabins where they tried to rest, share stories, and maintain family ties under constant threat of sale or separation. In cities like Boston, New York, or Charleston, enslaved people might work as artisans, dock workers, household servants, or street vendors. Urban slavery brought a different pattern of movement and contact, with enslaved people moving through crowded streets, hearing news, and sometimes forming networks that crossed household boundaries. Though still tightly controlled, city life could offer small opportunities to exchange information and support. Education and literacy also formed part of everyday experience, though unevenly. In some New England towns, laws required that children be taught to read, mainly so they could study the Bible. Simple horn books and primers offered basic letters and religious lessons. In other regions, Schooling was less organized and more dependent on family wealth. Wealthy planters and merchants hired tutors for their children or sent sons to England for advanced schooling. Daughters might receive training in reading, writing, and household management, but not usually in the classical languages or law. Print culture slowly expanded. Newspapers in port cities reported on shipping news, local politics, and events in Europe. Pamphlets carried religious sermons, political arguments, and practical advice. Almanacs, filled with calendars, weather predictions, and witty sayings, became common in many homes. The spread of print did not mean everyone could read, but it did create a shared space where ideas could circulate and where colonial debates could reach beyond a single town or colony. Law touched daily life in countless ways. Marriage, inheritance, debt, and crime all fell under legal rules shaped by English common law and modified by colonial statutes. A man who died without a will might leave his widow in a precarious situation if property passed mainly to sons or other male relatives. Debtors could face imprisonment or loss of land. For petty crimes, punishments often sought to shame as well as harm. Time in the stocks, public whippings, or wearing labels marking the offense. For more serious crimes, execution remained a possibility. Women's legal status complicated their daily experience. An unmarried woman or widow might own property, sue in court, or run a business in her own name. A married woman, however, fell under the doctrine that merged her legal identity with her husband's. She could not easily own property separately or make contracts without his consent. In practice, many wives acted as partners in economic life, especially in small farms and shops, but the law did not always recognize their contributions. Indigenous people living within or near colonial settlements often occupied an ambiguous legal position. Some treaties and agreements promised protection of certain lands or hunting rights, but colonial courts generally favored settlers in disputes. Native leaders sometimes appeared before colonial governors to protest encroachments or violence, using diplomatic channels to assert rights. Yet the steady expansion of English farms and towns, backed by assemblies and imperial charters, undercut many of those claims. Despite all these inequalities, colonists developed a sense that law and government, however flawed, were part of their identity. They saw themselves as subjects of a king, but also as members of communities with particular rights and customs. This combination of loyalty to the crown and attachment to local autonomy created a delicate balance. As long as imperial authorities allowed colonial assemblies and courts to function with relatively little interference, the system held. That balance depended heavily on economics, which is where the story now turns. The British Empire expected its colonies to contribute to the wealth and power of the mother country. To that end, Parliament passed laws such as the Navigation Acts, designed to channel colonial trade through English ships and ports. In theory, these regulations formed the skeleton of a mercantilist system, where colonies supplied raw materials and served as markets for finished goods. As the English colonies matured, they did not remain scattered outposts clinging to the edge of a continent. They became part of a busy, constantly moving web of trade. Ships sailed in and out of their harbors, warehouses filled and emptied, and fortunes were made and lost on the price of sugar, tobacco, fish, and cloth. This growing commercial world helped knit the colonies together, tied them more tightly to Britain, and quietly planted some of the grievances that would later explode into open conflict. From the viewpoint of London, the purpose of colonies was clear. They were assets in a mercantilist system. Many European thinkers believed that there was only so much wealth in the world, measured mainly in gold and silver. To grow powerful, a nation had to keep as much of that wealth as possible within its own borders and control the flow of trade. Colonies could supply raw materials like tobacco, lumber, furs, and rice, and they could buy finished goods from the mother country. In theory, this would make the whole imperial economy stronger and keep rivals like France and Spain from gaining those benefits. To enforce this vision, Parliament passed a series of laws often grouped under the name Navigation Acts. These rules said that certain valuable colonial products could only be shipped to England or to other English colonies, and that trade had to be carried on English or colonial ships with mainly English crews. Some foreign goods could reach the colonies only after first passing through English ports and paying customs duties. On paper, this gave Britain a tight grip on colonial commerce. In reality, the system depended on countless local choices. Colonial merchants and shipowners quickly learned which parts of the law were strictly enforced and which could be bent. Customs officers, often poorly paid and far from home, might accept bribes or simply ignore low-level smuggling. Governors sometimes shared in the profits of evasive trade. As long as no one pushed too hard, a kind of unwritten understanding developed. The empire had rules, but those rules were applied with flexibility. Historians later called this pattern salutary neglect because, for a time, it allowed both sides to prosper without constant friction. The ports of the colonies pulsed with this activity. In New England, towns like Boston, Newport, and later smaller harbors along the coast became centers of shipbuilding and maritime trade. New Englanders built sturdy vessels from the region's timber, crewed them with local sailors, and sent them along Atlantic routes. They exported dried and salted fish to the Caribbean and to Catholic Europe, where meatless days increased demand. They shipped livestock and timber to sugar islands that lacked open land for raising animals or cutting forests. In return, they brought back molasses and sugar, which fed rum distilleries and provided sweetener for growing colonial appetites. In the middle colonies, especially in New York and Philadelphia, merchants handled grain, flour, and livestock from the rich inland farms. Great millstones ground wheat into flour, which could be stored and shipped more easily than raw grain. These exports found markets in the Caribbean and sometimes in Europe. Ships returned with cloth, tools, metalware, tea, and other manufactured goods that colonial consumers increasingly desired. The bustling wharves of these ports, crowded with barrels, crates, and bales, symbolized the movement of goods and people that defined the era. Farther south, cities like Charleston in South Carolina and Norfolk in Virginia served as outlets for tobacco, rice, indigo, and later other staples. Planters loaded their crops onto ships that crossed the Atlantic, and in return received credit, luxury goods, and manufactured items from British merchants. Some of the wealthiest planters developed close relationships with particular firms in London or Bristol, exchanging letters about prices, fashions, and politics. These ties gave them access to fine furniture, books, and even tutors for their children, but also bound them to complex webs of debt and obligation. Credit was at the heart of this commercial world. Coins were scarce in many parts of the colonies, and paper money was limited and often distrusted. Instead, merchants and planters relied on credit extended by British trading houses or by local lenders. A planter might send a cargo of tobacco to his London factor and, in return, draw on credit to purchase goods even before the tobacco was sold. A shopkeeper in a small town might buy imported goods on credit from a city merchant, then sell them on credit to local farmers. Long chains of promises linked people who might never meet face to face. This system allowed trade to expand faster than the flow of hard cash would otherwise permit, but it carried risks. Bad harvests, shipwrecks, wars, or sudden changes in fashion could upset prices and leave debtors in trouble. When British merchants tightened credit, colonial merchants and planters felt the squeeze. Complaints about unfair terms, shortages of currency, and dependence on distant creditors became common themes in colonial discussions. Out of this trade and credit emerged what historians often call a consumer revolution. As the network of commerce grew, more and more colonial households gained access to goods that had once been rare luxuries. Imported cloth, ceramics, metal utensils, tea, sugar, and printed materials spread beyond the wealthiest families. Owning a teapot, a looking glass, or a printed almanac became part of what it meant to be respectable, even for modest farmers and artisans. People used these objects to mark social aspiration and to signal their place in the community. This growth in consumption did not mean everyone prospered equally. Many colonists remained poor, especially those on the frontiers, in crowded urban slums or trapped in bondage. Enslaved people saw the fruits of their labor sold away and the profits used to buy goods they might only handle as servants. Still, even they sometimes encountered imported items in the households where they worked. The same Atlantic system that exploited their labor also brought in the material symbols of European refinement and power. Smuggling became both a practical necessity and a cultural habit. When certain goods were taxed heavily or restricted by law, merchants and sailors looked for ways around the rules. A ship might leave Boston officially bound for another English port, but quietly stop at a French or Dutch island to trade. Cargoes could be misdeclared on paperwork, with high-tariff goods hidden under low-tariff ones. Small boats could slip into inlets and coves at night, unloading goods without passing customs posts. For many colonists, smuggling did not feel like rebellion, it felt like business. They saw the empire's regulations as distant and sometimes unreasonable, especially when those rules seemed to favor British merchants at colonial expense. Local communities might quietly accept smugglers as clever neighbors rather than criminals, especially if they brought in cheaper or more desirable goods. Governors who cracked down too harshly risked angering influential traders whose support they needed. At the same time, the imperial government viewed smuggling as a threat to revenue and control. Customs officers petitioned for more authority and resources to enforce the laws. British officials worried that lax enforcement encouraged foreign rivals and undermined the mercantilist system. This tension between local practice and imperial oversight lay dormant during many years of relative peace, but it was always present, waiting to be stirred by new policies or crises. Within the colonies, this expanding economic life also reshaped social relations. A new class of colonial merchants and professionals emerged in the port cities. These men, and occasionally women, made their living through trade, law, medicine, and small industries, rather than farming. They often dressed in the latest British fashions, subscribed to imported newspapers, and participated in clubs and societies where they read, discussed, and debated. They saw themselves as part of a broader Atlantic world of ideas and culture, not just as provincial settlers. In towns and small cities, artisans formed another important group. Carpenters, coopers, tailors, printers, and other skilled workers organized their work in shops and small partnerships. They trained apprentices and hired journeymen. Their livelihoods depended on both local demand and wider trade, as imported materials and changing tastes influenced what customers wanted. Artisans could be fiercely independent, proud of their craft and protective of their reputation. They would later play a key role in street-level politics, protests, and boycotts. The spread of trade routes also strengthened connections among the colonies themselves. A ship from Boston might carry fish and lumber to the Caribbean, then sail to Virginia with rum and sugar, picking up tobacco before heading home. Wagons and pack horses carried goods from coastal towns into the interior and back again. Letters and newspapers traveled along these same routes. Over time, colonists in different regions became more aware of one another's concerns, even as they maintained distinct local identities. This rising tide of commerce did not wash away older patterns of power, but it did create new possibilities for both cooperation and conflict. Assemblies might argue with governors over tariffs and port regulations. Merchants might join together to lobby for changes in trade laws or to resist new enforcement measures. Ordinary consumers, suddenly aware of how colonial and imperial policies affected prices and availability, could express their views through what they chose to buy or refuse to buy. War in Europe repeatedly disrupted this world. When Britain and France or Spain went to war, their colonies often became targets. Naval clashes and privateering threatened shipping. Coastal towns feared raids, yet war could also bring profit, as privateers captured enemy vessels and sold their cargoes, and as governments spent heavily on supplies. Each conflict tested the flexibility of the imperial system and left behind new grievances, particularly when London used wartime needs to justify tighter control over colonial trade. By the early 18th century, life in the British colonies had settled into patterns that felt familiar to many people. Towns and farms followed the rhythm of the seasons. Trade flowed through busy ports. Churches were established, ministers were trained, and most communities had regular worship on the Sabbath. On the surface, religion seemed firmly woven into everyday life. Yet, beneath that surface, many colonists felt that faith had grown cold, formal, and distant. Out of that unease came a wave of revival that historians now call the Great Awakening, a movement that shook the colonies and quietly helped prepare minds for future political change. In many colonial churches, especially among Congregationalists in New England and Anglicans in the South, worship could be dignified but predictable. Sermons were often carefully argued, more like lectures than urgent appeals. Ministers were respected, but some congregants saw them as part of an educated elite, set apart from ordinary people by schooling and social standing. Church membership rules could be strict, and in some regions, fewer people were joining as full communicants even if they still attended services. At the same time, social and economic changes were unsettling older certainties. Trade and commerce were expanding. New towns and frontier settlements were springing up along rivers and in backcountry valleys. Populations were growing and spreading beyond the reach of older churches. In these newer areas, regular ministers were scarce, and spiritual life could feel thin or disorganized. Many colonists worried that younger generations were more interested in money and comfort than in God. Into this environment stepped a new style of preaching that emphasized personal conversion, emotional experience, and the need for an inward change of heart. Revivalist ministers argued that it was not enough to be baptized, to attend church, or to live a respectable life. One had to feel the weight of sin, seek forgiveness, and experience what they called the new birth. This message was not entirely new, but the way it was delivered and the scale on which it spread were striking. In New England, one of the most influential voices belonged to Jonathan Edwards, a minister in the town of Northampton in Massachusetts. Edwards was highly educated and deeply rooted in traditional Calvinist theology, but he also believed that true religion involved the affections, the heart, as well as the mind. In the 1730s, he began to see signs of unusual religious concern among his congregants. People wept over their sins, sought counsel, and spoke of intense spiritual experiences. Edwards preached a series of sermons urging his listeners to consider the reality of God's justice and the beauty of divine grace. The revival that followed in Northampton spread to neighboring towns. Edwards later described these events in a written account, which circulated beyond New England and helped convince others that something important was happening. His most famous sermon, often remembered under the title about sinners in the hands of an angry God, used vivid language to warn of judgment and to call people to turn to Christ. For some listeners, such preaching was terrifying. For others, it opened a path to a renewed sense of forgiveness and hope. Around the same time, similar stirrings appeared in the Middle Colonies. In the Presbyterian churches of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, ministers like the Tennant family began to preach revivals that emphasized heartfelt conversion over formal respectability. They sometimes criticized more settled clergy as dead ministers who lacked true spiritual power. This criticism created divisions within denominations, as some pastors welcomed the revivals and others feared they were producing disorder, false enthusiasm, or disrespect for proper church authority. The movement took on a new, continent-spanning energy with the arrival of George Whitefield, an Anglican minister from Britain. Whitefield had a powerful voice and a dramatic style of preaching that attracted enormous crowds. He could not rely on existing churches to hold everyone who came to hear him, so he often preached in fields, town squares, and open spaces. People traveled miles to stand for hours, listening as he spoke about sin, redemption, and the need for a personal relationship with God. Whitefield's tours through the colonies turned local revivals into a shared colonial experience. He visited New England, the Middle Colonies, and the South, often more than once, and his printed sermons and journals spread his influence even further. Crowds included men and women, rich and poor, enslaved and free. Many who had never felt noticed by the religious establishment heard in his words a direct appeal to their own souls. He wept as he preached, raised and lowered his voice with emotional force, and used simple language that reached across social classes. This new style of preaching did not only move hearers emotionally, it also raised questions about authority. If a person's salvation depended on an inward change that only God could grant, and if that change might come through the preaching of an itinerant revivalist rather than a settled minister, then traditional church structures seemed less absolute. Some listeners began to judge ministers not by their education or social standing, but by whether their preaching seemed to carry spiritual power. Lay people, including women and the poor, sometimes felt emboldened to share testimonies, lead small groups, or challenge what they saw as cold or lifeless clergy. The Great Awakening did not touch every community in the same way. In some towns, revivals were intense and widespread, with many people reporting conversion experiences. In others, the movement passed more quietly, or provoked open resistance from ministers who saw it as dangerous. Congregations split into factions. Those who supported the revivals and wanted more emotional preaching were sometimes called new lights, in contrast to old lights who favored traditional forms. Baptists, long a minority, gained new members as converts sought churches that emphasized believers' baptism and congregational independence. Among enslaved Africans and African Americans, the revivals offered both spiritual comfort and a subtle challenge to the social order. Revival preachers often stressed that all people were equal before God, that anyone could experience grace, and that Christ died for sinners without regard to rank or race. Some enslaved people embraced this message, found meaning in stories of deliverance, and began to form their own Christian practices. In some meetings, black and white worshipers listened to the same sermons, even if they did not share equal status in daily life. This did not mean that revivalist ministers directly attacked slavery as an institution in most cases. Many accepted the social order of their day, and some even owned slaves themselves. But the logic of their preaching, which emphasized the worth of each soul and the insufficiency of outward status, could not help but plant seeds of questioning in some minds. Over time, especially among certain groups like the Quakers and some evangelicals, that questioning would grow into open anti-slavery sentiment. The movement also affected indigenous communities in complex ways. Some ministers and missionaries carried revivalist methods into native villages, preaching through interpreters and urging individual conversion. In a few cases, indigenous preachers themselves emerged, blending Christian teachings with native perspectives. Yet the broader framework of colonial expansion, land loss, and cultural pressure remained. The Great Awakening did not undo the injustices of colonization, but it added another layer to the religious encounters between native peoples and Europeans. Beyond individual conversions, the Great Awakening reshaped institutions. As churches split, new denominations and congregations formed. Some revivals led to the founding of schools and colleges meant to train ministers who were sympathetic to the new style of preaching. These institutions would later become important centers of learning, not only in theology, but in other fields as they grew. Socially, the revivals encouraged a more participatory religious culture. Ordinary people gained confidence to read the Bible for themselves, to question sermons, and to share their own experiences. Women, though still barred from formal ordination in most denominations, took leading roles in prayer meetings, hospitality, and the spread of religious literature. Young people often responded strongly to revival preaching, creating generational tensions in some families where parents were wary of the new enthusiasm. Critics of the movement were numerous and vocal. Some ministers and lay people argued that the revivals produced shallow, short-lived excitement rather than lasting spiritual growth. They pointed to cases where people who had wept and shouted at meetings later fell back into old patterns of behavior. They worried that uneducated itinerant preachers could mislead congregations with errors or extreme claims. Others objected to the disorder that sometimes accompanied large gatherings, shouting, fainting, or other physical displays that they saw as unseemly. Supporters responded that true religion had always stirred human hearts, and that emotional reactions were natural when people confronted the realities of sin and grace. They insisted that, despite excesses, many had experienced genuine transformation. They also argued that the revivals cut through mere formalism, calling people to a living faith rather than a comfortable habit. In terms of political ideas, the Great Awakening did not directly call for independence or revolution. Preachers focused on the state of the soul, not on the structures of empire. Yet the movement had important indirect effects. By lifting up the authority of individual conscience and personal experience, it weakened the unquestioned prestige of traditional elites. If a humble farmer or a poor widow could discern God's will and experience divine grace, why should social rank alone command respect? The revivals also created networks that crossed colonial boundaries. Preachers traveled from New England to the South, from the middle colonies to the backcountry, creating a shared religious conversation. Pamphlets and letters about the revivals circulated widely. Colonists in different regions found themselves reacting to the same figures, like George Whitefield, and debating the same questions about enthusiasm and order. This continental dimension of the Great Awakening helped lay the groundwork for later cooperation on political issues. By the middle of the 18th century, the British colonies in North America had grown from fragile footholds into societies with their own towns, churches, and trading networks. Yet their future was far from secure. To the north and west stretched the broad domains of New France, linked by rivers and alliances with powerful indigenous nations. Beyond them stood the Spanish Empire. When Britain and France clashed once more in a wider imperial struggle, North America became one of the main battlefields. The conflict that colonists later called the French and Indian War would redraw the map of the continent and quietly set the stage for a break between Britain and its own colonies. The roots of this war lay in long-standing rivalry between Britain and France. For generations, these two powers had fought over trade, territory, and influence in Europe and around the world. In earlier wars, fighting had reached North America, but often as a side theater. Forts were taken and returned in peace treaties. Borders shifted slightly. What made this new conflict different was the scale and the stakes in the interior of the continent, especially in the region around the Ohio River Valley. That valley, rich in land and furs, lay at the meeting point of British, French, and native interests. British colonists in the older seaboard colonies, particularly in Virginia and Pennsylvania, dreamed of expanding westward. Land speculators formed companies, secured grants from colonial governments or from the crown, and began to claim tracts beyond the Appalachian Mountains. At the same time, French officials in New France were determined to hold on to their network of forts and trading posts that stretched from the St. Lawrence River through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi. Control of the Ohio country, they believed, was essential to connect Canada with Louisiana and to keep British influence away from their indigenous allies. For the indigenous nations who actually lived in and near the Ohio Valley, European rivalry offered both danger and opportunity. Groups such as the Shawnee, Delaware, and members of the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy had their own diplomatic and military calculations. Some had long-standing relations with the French, others with the British, and many tried to play the empires against each other to preserve autonomy. None wanted to see their lands simply swallowed by waves of colonial settlers. The first sparks of open conflict came when the French began to strengthen their hold on the Ohio region. They built a chain of forts, including one at a strategic meeting point of rivers where the modern city of Pittsburgh now stands. This post, named Fort Duquesne, blocked British traders and land companies from securing the territory they claimed. Virginia officials, in particular, saw the French move as a direct challenge to their authority and economic hopes. To push back, the governor of Virginia sent a young officer, George Washington, on a mission into the Ohio country. Washington, still in his early 20s, carried orders to warn the French to withdraw from lands Virginia considered its own. The French officers politely but firmly refused. Tensions rose. In a later expedition, Washington and a small force of colonial soldiers clashed with a French scouting party. Shots were fired and a French officer was killed. What might have been a localized skirmish quickly spun into a larger crisis. Expecting retaliation, Washington hastily constructed a small fortification he called Fort Necessity. French forces, supported by indigenous allies, surrounded the position. After a brief and chaotic fight, Washington surrendered. He and his men were allowed to withdraw, but the encounter marked a clear opening of hostilities. What had begun as a dispute over forts and land grants was turning into war. At first, British efforts in North America went poorly. Regular troops sent from Britain, led by General Edward Braddock, marched westward with colonial militias to attempt a direct assault on Fort Duquesne. Braddock, trained in European-style warfare, discounted warnings from colonial officers and indigenous guides about the dangers of moving a large, rigid column through dense forests. Near the Monongahela River, French and indigenous forces ambushed the British. The resulting battle was a disaster for Braddock's army. Many were killed or wounded, including Braddock himself, who died during the retreat. George Washington, serving as an aide, distinguished himself by helping organize survivors, but the defeat shook colonial confidence in British leadership. These setbacks showed that European tactics could not simply be transplanted into North American landscapes without adaptation. Forests, rivers, and long supply lines favored smaller, more flexible forces, especially those familiar with indigenous styles of warfare that emphasized ambush, mobility, and knowledge of the terrain. French and native warriors used these advantages effectively in the early years of the war, raiding British frontier settlements and harassing forts. While battles raged on the frontier, colonial leaders met to discuss common defense. At a gathering in Albany, representatives from several colonies and from the Iroquois Confederacy came together. There, Benjamin Franklin and others proposed a plan of union that would have created a colonial council for joint defense and Indian affairs, with delegates from each colony and a royal president. The plan was ultimately rejected, both by colonial assemblies wary of surrendering local power and by British officials who feared giving colonists too much unity. Still, the Albany meeting was significant. It showed that some colonists were beginning to imagine cooperation beyond the usual boundaries, even if that vision was not yet realized. As fighting continued, the conflict in North America merged into a far larger war. In Europe, Britain and France, along with their allies, plunged into what is known as the 7 Years' War. The struggle extended from Europe to the Caribbean, from West Africa to India. In that global context, North America became one theater among many, but a crucial one. Control of the continent's resources and trade routes could shape the outcome of the larger imperial contest. Under new leadership in London, especially the energetic minister William Pitt the Elder, Britain decided to commit greater resources to the North American campaign. The government poured money into the war, paid for more regular troops, and subsidized colonial militias. Naval power was used to cut French supply lines across the Atlantic, making it harder for New France to receive reinforcements and provisions. At the same time, British commanders began to adapt their strategies, working more closely with colonial forces and learning from earlier mistakes. Gradually, the balance shifted. British and colonial troops captured key French strongholds along the St. Lawrence and in the interior. The siege and fall of the fortress at Louisbourg opened the gateway to the heartland of New France. The most famous turning point came in the campaign against Quebec. British forces under General James Wolfe advanced up the St. Lawrence, while French defenders led by the Marquis de Montcalm prepared to hold the city, perched above steep cliffs. In a daring move, British troops scaled a narrow path up the heights above Quebec, reaching a plateau known as the Plains of Abraham. There, in a brief but decisive battle, they defeated the French forces. Both Wolfe and Montcalm were mortally wounded, turning the clash into a moment heavy with drama and symbolism. The fall of Quebec meant that French control over Canada was effectively broken. Later campaigns would complete British victory, but the outcome was already clear. For indigenous allies of France, this turn of events was deeply unsettling. Many had chosen to align with the French in part because they saw them as a counterweight to British settlements, which seemed more intent on pushing native peoples off the land. With French power collapsing, these nations faced a future in which Britain would stand as the dominant European force in eastern North America. Some sought new diplomatic paths. Others prepared to defend their interests as best they could against a stronger empire. The war formally ended with the Treaty of Paris, signed in the early 1760s. Under its terms, France ceded almost all its territories in mainland North America. Britain gained control of Canada and the lands east of the Mississippi River, while Spain, which had entered the war on the French side, ceded Florida to Britain but received French claims west of the Mississippi as compensation. On maps in European capitals, the continent now looked overwhelmingly British in the east. From a distance, this looked like a triumphant moment for Britain and for its colonies. The long-feared French presence on the northern and western frontiers was gone. Colonial merchants hoped for new trade opportunities in former French territories. Settlers and land companies looked greedily toward the rich lands beyond the Appalachians. Some colonists saw the victory as proof that they had helped build a powerful empire through their militias, supplies, and taxes. Yet beneath the surface, the war had created serious problems that would soon strain the relationship between Britain and its colonies. First was the question of debt. The war had been extremely expensive. Britain had borrowed heavily to fund troops, ships, and subsidies. After the fighting ended, government officials in London looked at the swollen national debt and asked a pointed question. Since the war had been fought partly to defend the colonies, should not the colonies help pay more of the cost? Second was the challenge of governing the newly acquired territories. Vast regions with French settlers and indigenous nations now fell under British authority. Officials needed to decide how these lands would be organized, who would control trade, and whether colonial settlers would be allowed to pour across the mountains. Many frontier colonists assumed that victory meant open expansion. Native communities, who had not been consulted in European peace talks, feared that British rule would bring more aggressive land grabs. Those fears seemed justified when British officers replaced French practices in dealing with native peoples. Some British commanders ended long-standing customs of gift-giving and trade that French officials had used to maintain alliances. Indigenous leaders saw this as a sign of disrespect and bad faith. Resentment and anxiety built among nations in the Great Lakes and Ohio regions, contributing to a broad native uprising often called Pontiac's War, after one of the prominent leaders. Warriors attacked British forts and settlements, trying to resist the new imperial order. In response to the turmoil and to the cost of defending distant frontiers, the British Crown issued a royal proclamation that tried to draw a clear line between colonial settlements and native lands. The proclamation of 1763 declared that colonists could not legally settle west of a designated boundary along the Appalachian Mountains without special permission. The goal was to stabilize relations with indigenous nations by limiting encroachment and to bring westward expansion under tighter imperial control. For many colonists, especially land speculators and frontier families, the proclamation felt like a betrayal. They had fought and sacrificed in the war, expecting that victory would open the interior. Instead, they saw a distant government telling them where they could and could not live, seemingly favoring former enemies over loyal subjects. While the proclamation was not always strictly enforced and settlers soon crossed the line anyway, it planted seeds of distrust. When the guns of the Great Imperial War fell silent, many colonists believed they stood at the start of a golden age. France had lost its mainland empire in North America. British flags now flew over vast territories stretching to the Mississippi. Yet almost as soon as peace was declared, the relationship between Britain and its colonies began to fray. The very victory that seemed to secure the empire set off a chain of decisions in London and reactions in America that would, step by step, turn loyalty into anger. From the British government's point of view, the situation was simple in one sense and deeply troubling in another. The war had been enormously expensive. To defeat France in Europe, on the seas, and in the colonies, Britain had borrowed heavily. The national debt had soared. Interest payments and the cost of maintaining garrisons around the world strained the treasury. British officials insisted that the colonies, whose security had been greatly improved by the war, should bear a larger share of imperial expenses. At the same time, Britain faced the challenge of governing newly won territories and restive indigenous nations. The native uprising, often called Pontiac's War, had shown that the interior was far from peaceful. Defending long, exposed frontiers and maintaining forts in the backcountry required soldiers and money. Imperial planners concluded that a permanent standing army should remain in North America, both to manage native relations and to enforce British authority. That army needed support, and London looked westward for revenue. The first major step came in the form of measures aimed at tightening control over trade and customs. Many colonial merchants had long treated the laws of trade as negotiable. Smuggling and creative bookkeeping were part of everyday business. British officials believed that such practices deprived the empire of much-needed income. They began to issue general search warrants, known as writs of assistance, allowing customs officers to search ships, warehouses, and even private homes for untaxed goods. To merchants and lawyers in the colonies, these writs felt like a dangerous overreach. In Massachusetts, a young lawyer named James Otis delivered a passionate argument against them, claiming that they violated the natural rights of Englishmen. He challenged the idea that Parliament could grant such sweeping powers without regard for traditional protections. Although the courts upheld the writs, Otis's words circulated widely, feeding a growing sense that imperial power might threaten liberty as well as order. Soon, London moved from enforcing existing laws to creating new taxes. One early measure placed duties on sugar and certain other imported goods. It was justified partly as a way to regulate trade with the French and Spanish Caribbean, and partly as a revenue measure. More important than its details was its principle. Parliament was now deliberately using its power to raise money from the colonies, not just to steer commerce. Colonial merchants responded with evasions and protests, insisting that such taxes would hurt their business and that they had no voice in the body imposing them. The real shock, however, came with a law that touched a much wider range of people, the Stamp Act. This measure required that many printed items in the colonies carry a special stamped paper purchased from the government. Legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards, and even some licenses were all affected. Instead of being collected at distant ports, this tax would be felt in everyday transactions in towns and villages across the colonies. For British officials, the Stamp Act seemed reasonable. People in Britain had long paid similar stamp duties. Why should colonists, now more secure than ever, not contribute in the same way? But in America, the act struck a nerve. It was not just the cost, though lawyers, printers, and merchants certainly complained about that. It was the principle, an internal tax, levied by a parliament in which colonists had no representatives of their own, and enforced by officials who did not answer to colonial assemblies. Colonial critics argued that such taxation violated a core right. They insisted that English subjects could not be taxed without their consent, usually given through their elected representatives. In Britain, that meant the House of Commons. In America, colonists believed it should mean their own assemblies. The claim that colonists enjoyed virtual representation in Parliament because members acted for the empire as a whole did little to satisfy them. They knew how their local politics worked and could not accept that distant legislators, whom they had never chosen, understood or defended their interests. Opposition to the Stamp Act took many forms. In formal resolutions, colonial assemblies declared that only they had the right to tax their inhabitants. Newspapers printed essays attacking the act as unjust and dangerous. Lawyers pledged to avoid using stamped paper if possible. Merchants organized non-importation agreements, promising to stop or reduce purchases of British goods until the law was repealed. These boycotts hit British exporters hard, demonstrating the economic leverage that colonial consumers could wield. On the streets, anger boiled over in more direct ways. In Boston and other towns, crowds took aim at the appointed stamp distributors. Effigies were hanged from trees and burned. Houses of officials were attacked and ransacked. One Boston crowd destroyed the home of the royal lieutenant governor, tearing apart his furniture and scattering his papers. Although many colonial leaders disapproved of such violence, they also recognized that the sheer intensity of popular resistance made the Stamp Act difficult to enforce. In a rare moment of intercolonial cooperation, delegates from several colonies gathered in what became known as the Stamp Act Congress. Meeting in New York, they issued a declaration asserting that colonists were entitled to the same rights as other British subjects, including the principle that taxes should come from their own representatives. They did not yet call for independence. They still professed loyalty to the king, but they drew a clear line between legitimate regulation of trade and illegitimate internal taxation without consent. Facing colonial resistance and pressure from British merchants hurt by boycotts, Parliament eventually backed down. It repealed the Stamp Act, and colonists celebrated with bonfires, toasts, and expressions of relief. Many believed that they had successfully defended their rights within the empire. At the same time, however, Parliament passed another measure, the Declaratory Act, asserting that it had full power to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. This statement of authority quietly warned that, although one tax had been removed, the struggle over imperial control was far from over. In the years that followed, British officials tried a different approach. Instead of direct internal taxes like the stamp duty, they turned back to customs and trade. A series of measures often grouped together as the Townshend duties imposed new taxes on imports such as glass, paper, paint, and tea. The aim was once again to raise revenue from the colonies, this time to help pay the salaries of royal governors and judges, making them less dependent on colonial assemblies. For colonists, this plan raised new concerns. If officials received their pay directly from the crown, rather than from local legislatures, they would be less responsive to local opinions and more likely to enforce unpopular policies. The duties were, in effect, another round of taxation without consent, even if framed as customs. Colonial writers argued that the distinction between internal and external taxes was less important than the larger principle of representation. Once again, resistance took shape. Essays signed with pen names appeared in newspapers, explaining the danger of allowing any precedent for taxation without representation. Merchants revived non-importation agreements, and ordinary consumers pledged to avoid taxed goods. Women, who managed many household purchases, played a visible role in these efforts, organizing to produce homespun cloth and reduce reliance on imported textiles. They turned consumption into a political act, declaring that virtue required sacrifice and self-reliance. Britain responded by strengthening enforcement mechanisms. A new customs board, headquartered in Boston, took charge of collecting duties and cracking down on smuggling. Naval vessels patrolled harbors. Customs officers used their expanded powers to seize ships suspected of violating trade laws. One seizure in Boston, involving a vessel associated with the popular merchant John Hancock, sparked angry demonstrations and clashes with authorities. Tensions in Boston grew especially sharp. The presence of customs officials, supported by royal authority, enraged many residents who believed their traditional liberties under threat. Street protests became more common. To support imperial enforcement and protect officials, Britain stationed regular army troops in the town. For Bostonians, the sight of red-coated soldiers marching and drilling in their streets during peacetime felt like an occupation. For British commanders, the soldiers were a necessary show of force to uphold lawful authority. Across the colonies, reactions varied. Some regions, especially in the South, were slower to feel the direct impact of the Townshend duties, but they watched developments in New England and the Middle Colonies with interest. Pamphlets and letters carried news of boycotts, seizures, and troop deployments. Even colonists who were cautious about street protests worried about the implications of a standing army stationed among civilians and of judges and governors insulated from local control. Over time, non-importation campaigns began to hurt British exporters again. In London, merchants petitioned Parliament, arguing that colonial markets were too valuable to risk over modest revenue measures. Within the colonies, boycotts also tested social cohesion. Some merchants broke ranks and continued to import taxed goods, leading to public shaming, threats, or even attacks on property. Political committees in ports worked to enforce community discipline, strengthening local organization that would later be crucial in larger protests. Under growing pressure, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties, choosing to maintain only the tax on tea as a symbol of its authority. For British leaders, this seemed a reasonable compromise. For many colonists, it looked like a partial victory mixed with a warning. The basic problem remained unsolved. Parliament still claimed a right to tax them without their own representatives, and colonial assemblies still insisted that this was incompatible with traditional English liberty. The post-war decades thus turned a military alliance into a political argument. During the conflict with France, colonists had fought alongside British troops, supplied provisions, and paid extra taxes through their assemblies. They had imagined themselves as partners in a shared imperial project. After the war, as London asserted more direct control, many colonists came to feel treated less like partners and more like subjects to be managed and mined for revenue. By the time most of the Townshend duties were repealed, a dangerous pattern had already formed. Parliament would pass new measures, colonists would protest and boycott, British merchants would complain, and London would step back just enough to calm the storm while insisting on its authority. Underneath each compromise, however, suspicion deepened. Nowhere did that tension feel sharper than in Boston, the port town that had become a laboratory for imperial enforcement and colonial resistance. After Parliament withdrew most of the Townshend duties but kept the tax on tea, many colonists tried to treat the moment as a victory. Non-importation agreements began to loosen. Merchants who had accepted short-term losses to make a point were eager to reopen trade fully. Ordinary consumers, tired of sacrifice, were ready to buy imported goods again. But the underlying issue had not changed. Parliament still claimed the right to tax the colonies without their own representatives, and the presence of British troops in Boston was a constant reminder of imperial power. Those troops had arrived earlier, when London decided to support customs officials with military force. Red-coated soldiers now drilled on the town common, walked the narrow streets, and sometimes looked for extra work in their off-hours. For many Bostonians, this felt like an occupation. Crowded into a small town where everyone knew everyone else, soldiers and civilians bumped shoulders in taverns, on the wharves, and near shops. Competition for employment angered local laborers, who resented soldiers undercutting wages. Small arguments over money or insults could easily flare into something larger. The cold evening that would later be remembered as the Boston Massacre began with one of those confrontations. A sentry guarding a customs house was taunted by townspeople, some of them apprentices and sailors, who threw snowballs and insults. The exact details would be fiercely debated afterward, but the rough outline is clear. The sentry called for help. More soldiers arrived, nervous and surrounded by an angry crowd that grew larger and louder. In that tense circle of steel and shouting, someone yelled an order, or someone slipped, or a musket went off by accident. Shots cracked through the night. When the smoke cleared, several colonists lay dead or dying, including a sailor of African and indigenous ancestry named Crispus Attucks, who became one of the first martyrs of the colonial cause. The incident sent shockwaves through Boston and beyond. Patriots seized on the event as proof that standing armies in peacetime were a threat to liberty. British officials insisted that the soldiers had been provoked and had feared for their lives. To calm the situation, town leaders and the colonial governor negotiated. The troops were eventually removed from the center of Boston and stationed elsewhere. The soldiers involved in the shooting stood trial, defended by none other than John Adams, an ardent critic of British policies who nevertheless believed that even hated soldiers deserved a fair hearing. Some were acquitted, others received reduced punishments. Adams later said he was proud to have shown that colonists upheld law and justice, even amid anger. Still, the image of British soldiers firing on unarmed townspeople remained powerful. Engravings, newspaper accounts, and sermons spread the story across the colonies. The words Boston Massacre fixed the event in memory as an example of imperial tyranny. In taverns and homes far from Massachusetts, colonists began to picture redcoats not as distant defenders of empire, but as potential oppressors standing in their own streets. For a short time after the massacre, tensions eased slightly. Trade flowed more freely. The most visible symbols of military occupation had been removed from Boston's center. Yet beneath this relative calm, new forms of organization were taking shape. Colonists who feared that rights might be eroded bit by bit began to build structures to share information and coordinate responses. One of the most important developments was the spread of committees of correspondence. These were groups created by colonial assemblies or by local patriots to communicate with other towns and colonies about threats to liberty. In Massachusetts, Samuel Adams and his allies helped establish such committees, which wrote letters describing British actions and urging vigilance. Other colonies soon followed. The committees exchanged news, drafted resolutions, and built networks of trust among people who had never met, but who now saw themselves engaged in a common struggle. These communications meant that a crisis in one place could quickly become a concern for many others. When British authorities boarded and burned an American vessel involved in smuggling near Rhode Island, anger did not stay confined to that colony. Committees spread the news, and the incident became part of a larger story about abuse of power and disregard for colonial rights. The colonies were slowly learning to respond as a loosely connected community rather than as isolated provinces. While this political infrastructure grew, Parliament made another fateful decision. The British East India Company, a giant trading enterprise, was facing financial trouble. It held large stocks of tea that it could not sell quickly enough, while smugglers in the colonies brought in cheaper, untaxed tea from Dutch sources. To rescue the company and to subtly assert Parliament's right to tax the colonies, lawmakers passed what became known as the Tea Act. The Tea Act did not actually raise the tax on tea. It lowered the overall cost by allowing the company to ship tea directly to the colonies, bypassing some middlemen while still collecting the existing duty. British officials thought colonists would welcome cheaper tea and accept the small symbolic tax as a fact of imperial life. They misjudged the mood. For many colonial leaders, the problem was not the price of tea, but the principle. Accepting the tea meant accepting Parliament's right to tax them without their consent. In several ports, opponents organized to prevent the tea from being unloaded. Consignees who were supposed to receive and sell the tea were pressured to resign. In some places, ships turned back before entering harbors. In Boston, however, the situation became a showdown. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, determined to uphold imperial law, refused to allow the tea ships to leave without paying the duty and unloading their cargo. Colonial law prevented the ships from lingering indefinitely. A deadline approached. On a December evening, a large crowd gathered at a meeting in Boston's Old South Meeting House. Speakers denounced the Tea Act and debated what to do. The atmosphere was tense. Many knew that any direct attack on the tea would be a risky challenge to British authority. Yet others argued that allowing the tea to land would be a surrender of principle that future generations would regret. When it became clear that negotiations had failed and that Hutchinson would not yield, a signal was given. Men disguised themselves loosely as Mohawk Indians, a symbolic choice meant to emphasize American identity and perhaps to shield individuals from easy recognition. They moved quickly to the waterfront, boarded the ships carrying tea, and worked through the night to break open chests and pour the contents into the harbor. Salt water turned dark as thousands of pounds of tea scattered. The participants kept careful order, damaging little else. When they left, the tea was ruined, but the ships themselves were mostly unharmed. News of the Boston Tea Party, as it would later be called, spread rapidly. In Britain, officials were outraged. They saw the destruction of a valuable cargo as a direct attack on property and on the authority of Parliament. Even some sympathizers with colonial grievances thought the act too radical. In the colonies, opinions varied. Many celebrated the bold stand against the Tea Act. Others worried that such defiance would provoke a harsh response. No one doubted that response would come. Parliament answered with a series of measures aimed at punishing Massachusetts and warning other colonies against similar acts. Colonists labeled these the intolerable acts. One law closed the port of Boston to most trade until the destroyed tea was paid for, striking at the town's economic lifeblood. Another reshaped the government of Massachusetts, giving the royal governor more power and reducing the role of the elected assembly and town meetings. A third allowed royal officials accused of certain crimes in the colonies to be tried elsewhere in the empire, raising fears that abuses might go unpunished. A fourth required colonists to provide lodging for British troops in certain cases, deepening concerns about standing armies among civilians. To the people of Massachusetts, these acts felt like a siege. The port closure threw many out of work. Artisans, sailors, and merchants faced sudden hardship. British troops returned in greater numbers. Yet, instead of isolating Boston, the punishment drew sympathy from other colonies. Towns in Connecticut, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and beyond sent food, supplies, and words of support. Days of fasting and prayer were proclaimed in solidarity. Colonists who had once seen Boston as a distant, sometimes troublesome town now began to say, "Today Boston, tomorrow us," and to see the struggle as shared. One British measure added another layer of anxiety far beyond New England. The Quebec Act reorganized the government of the former French territory in ways that alarmed many colonists. It allowed the practice of Roman Catholicism and extended Quebec's boundaries southward into regions that some colonies had claimed. For Protestant colonists who feared Catholic influence and who already disliked restrictions on Western expansion, the act seemed part of a pattern, an empire willing to use Catholic provinces and indigenous alliances to hem in their growth. Facing this combination of punitive laws and perceived threats, colonial leaders concluded that local protests were no longer enough. It was time for a general meeting of colonies to coordinate a response. Committees of correspondence played a key role in arranging this gathering, which would become known as the First Continental Congress. Delegates from most colonies traveled to Philadelphia, a city chosen partly for its central location and its reputation for tolerance. The Congress brought together men with differing backgrounds, interests, and visions. Radicals from Massachusetts and Virginia, such as Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry, mixed with more cautious figures who still hoped for reconciliation. Some delegates wanted to confront Parliament strongly, others feared that too sharp a stance would lead to ruin, yet they shared a belief that colonial rights must be defended and that acting together was better than standing alone. After intense debate, the Congress adopted several important measures. It issued a Declaration of Rights asserting that colonists were entitled to life, liberty, and property, and that only their own representatives could impose taxes. It acknowledged Parliament's authority over trade but rejected its claim to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. It also created the Continental Association, a system of non-importation, non-consumption, and non-exportation designed to pressure Britain economically. Local committees in towns and counties across the colonies were tasked with enforcing these agreements, inspecting goods, and encouraging neighbors to comply. The Congress stopped short of declaring independence or calling for immediate war. It sent a petition to the king, expressing loyalty but asking him to intercede with Parliament to restore traditional rights. Many still hoped that the crisis could be resolved within the imperial family, with misunderstandings cleared and abuses corrected. Yet at the same time, colonies began to prepare quietly for the possibility that force might be used against them. In New England especially, local militias trained more regularly. Some men volunteered as Minutemen, ready to move quickly if alarms were raised. Towns collected powder, shot, and weapons. They studied the lessons of earlier conflicts, aware that British regulars were formidable but not invincible. Patriot leaders used sermons, pamphlets, and meetings to explain the stakes, arguing that if they yielded now, future generations would live in chains. By the time the First Continental Congress adjourned, the colonies had stepped onto a narrow ledge between peace and war. They had organized boycotts, formed committees, and penned eloquent petitions to the king. But they had also begun quietly storing gunpowder, drilling militias, and talking openly about the possibility that British troops might soon march against them. The final transformation from protest to armed conflict began not with a formal declaration, but with hurried whispers, midnight rides, and gunsmoke over small New England towns. In Massachusetts, General Thomas Gage sat at the heart of a tightening spiral. As royal governor and military commander, he was charged with enforcing the coercive acts and maintaining order. From London, he received instructions to arrest key rebel leaders if possible and to seize colonial military supplies before they could be used against the crown. Around him, patriots organized in town meetings and in secretive groups like the Sons of Liberty, watching every move of the army and building their own networks of communication. One of the patriots' greatest advantages was information. Committees of correspondence shared news rapidly. Sympathizers in Boston and even in British circles quietly relayed rumors of planned marches. In the countryside, riders were ready to carry warnings along well-known routes. The colonists knew that the redcoats, though powerful, depended on long, exposed lines of march and supply. If they could move first, they might turn British strength into vulnerability. The flashpoint came when Gage received orders to move against colonial stores of arms and powder in the town of Concord, west of Boston. Capturing those supplies would send a clear signal that Britain meant to enforce its will by disarming resistance. Letting them remain would allow the provincial militias to grow ever stronger. Gage decided on a secret night march. Regular troops would slip out of Boston, cross the water quietly, and move along the road to Concord before dawn, seizing or destroying weapons and ammunition. Secrecy, however, was hard to maintain in a small, crowded town. Patriot spies learned of the plan, or at least of unusual troop movements. As British soldiers began to embark in the darkness, signals were sent from Boston's church steeples and wharves. Riders set out along the country roads to warn local leaders that the regulars were coming. Among them was Paul Revere, a silversmith and messenger long involved in Boston's resistance network, along with other riders such as William Dawes and Samuel Prescott. Their journeys through the night carried the alarm from one village to another, turning quiet homes into gathering points for armed men. In the early morning, as the column of British regulars approached the village of Lexington, they found a small line of colonial militiamen, often called Minutemen, waiting on the green. The local captain did not expect to stop the king's troops. His goal was to show that the town was not cowed, that free men would stand together. The air was cold and tense. Hard words may have been exchanged. Then, in a moment no one could later describe with certainty, a shot rang out. No one could say whose musket fired first, but once that first sound cracked the morning stillness, more shots followed. In the brief confusion, several colonial militiamen fell. The British column quickly pushed through Lexington and continued on toward Concord. For patriots, the skirmish was both a tragedy and a turning point. Blood had now been shed between British soldiers and armed colonists, not in a riot over goods or taxes, but in open confrontation. At Concord, British forces found some supplies but fewer than they expected, as many weapons had already been removed by locals warned in advance. Near the town's North Bridge, another clash occurred. Colonial militiamen, gathered from surrounding communities, confronted British troops guarding the bridge. This time, when shots were exchanged, the provincials pressed forward and drove the redcoats back. For the first time, British soldiers retreated before an organized colonial force in battle. The real ordeal for the regulars began as they withdrew toward Boston. Militia units, alerted by the night's riders and the morning's events, poured in from towns and farms. They did not meet the British in one grand, formal battle. Instead, they used the land they knew so well. From behind stone walls, trees, and houses, they fired at the marching column, then slipped away to reappear farther down the road. The British line, tired and under constant attack, suffered mounting casualties. Only with the arrival of reinforcements did the column manage to reach the safety of Charlestown, near Boston. By then, the road from Concord and Lexington had become a symbol. Ditches and fences where ordinary farmers had stood and fired at the king's troops. The events of that day, later remembered with the phrase about a shot heard around the world, marked the psychological break as much as the physical one. Both sides now knew that this was no longer just a political dispute, it was a war. In the days that followed, militia units from across New England converged on the Boston area. Instead of simply returning home, they encamped around the town, forming a loose siege line that penned British forces on the peninsula. Improvised forts and earthworks appeared on hills and roads leading into the city. The British still controlled the harbor with their navy, but their movements by land were constrained. The siege of Boston had begun, led not by a formal continental army, but by a patchwork force loyal to their own colonies, yet increasingly aware of a shared cause. While New England simmered into open conflict, colonial leaders elsewhere faced a stark question. Would they support this armed resistance, or would they side with the Crown against what could be labeled rebellion? Many people in the Middle Colonies and the South had sympathized with Massachusetts's grievances, but they also feared the chaos of war and the possible ruin of trade and property. The news from Lexington and Concord forced them to decide whether the bonds of empire or the bonds of colonial solidarity would guide their actions. The answer began to emerge when the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. This gathering, larger and more urgent than the first, brought together delegates from all 13 colonies. Some arrived wearing militia uniforms, a sign that debate at the meeting might soon be tested on the battlefield. Others came with instructions from their assemblies urging caution and hoping that renewed petitions might still reconcile them with the king. Inside the meeting halls, arguments were intense but measured. Few delegates set out with the goal of proclaiming independence. Most continued to profess loyalty to King George while sharply criticizing Parliament and its ministers. Yet, they could not ignore the reality that British soldiers had fired on colonial militia, and that those militia now surrounded an imperial garrison. Someone had to take responsibility for coordinating this armed resistance. One of the Congress's most significant decisions was to create a continental army, transforming the New England militias besieging Boston into a force that claimed to act for all the colonies. To command this army, delegates chose George Washington, the Virginia planter and veteran of the earlier war against France. His selection carried both military and political weight. As a Southerner, he balanced the strong New England presence in the early fighting, signaling that the struggle was not just a Massachusetts affair, but a continental one. His dignified bearing and reputation for courage added personal authority. Washington traveled to the encampment around Boston, taking command of an army that was more a collection of provincial units than a unified force. He faced shortages of gunpowder, food, and equipment, as well as short enlistments and uneven discipline. Yet his presence began the gradual process of forging a more coherent army. He imposed order where he could, listened to New England officers who knew the terrain, and worked with the Congress to secure supplies. As all this unfolded, the British attempted to break the siege by seizing the heights around Boston. Colonial forces learned that the British planned to occupy strategic hills that overlooked the town and the harbor. In response, New England militia hurriedly fortified a position on a rise called Breed's Hill on the Charlestown Peninsula. When British troops advanced to dislodge them, a fierce battle erupted, later known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, after a nearby elevation. The colonial defenders, though relatively inexperienced, held their ground through repeated assaults, using the high position and prepared earthworks to their advantage. They inflicted heavy casualties on the disciplined British ranks. Only when their ammunition ran low did they withdraw, allowing the British to claim the field. Militarily, it was a British victory. Psychologically, it was something else. Colonists drew confidence from the fact that their untried forces had stood against seasoned regulars and made them pay dearly for every step. Back in Philadelphia, Congress moved along two tracks that might seem contradictory, but reflected the uncertainty of the moment. On one hand, delegates sent an appeal known as the Olive Branch Petition to King George, expressing loyalty and asking him to intervene to stop Parliament's harsh measures and the military clashes. They framed themselves as faithful subjects, seeking the protection of the crown against corrupt ministers. On the other hand, They began organizing war efforts, appointing generals, and planning for the manufacture or importation of arms. The king's response, when it came, made the direction of events clearer. Rather than treating the petition as a basis for negotiation, he declared the colonies to be an open rebellion and announced his intention to suppress it. British officials prepared to hire German auxiliaries, often called Hessians by the colonists, to bolster their forces. From London's perspective, the colonies had crossed a line. The empire could not tolerate armed defiance without risking its authority everywhere. Within the colonies, loyalties hardened. Those who supported resistance increasingly called themselves patriots. Those who remained loyal to the king, often called loyalists or Tories, found themselves under suspicion or pressure in many communities. Loyalists came from varied backgrounds: royal officials, Anglican clergy, merchants tied closely to British trade, recent immigrants who feared instability, and some ordinary farmers who simply believed rebellion was wrong or hopeless. In some regions, especially in parts of New York, the South, and the backcountry, loyalists were numerous and would later fight alongside British troops or form their own units. Families and neighborhoods were divided. Brothers and cousins chose different sides. Ministers faced congregations split over the question of obedience to worldly rulers versus defense of perceived God-given rights. Indigenous nations watched these developments with wary eyes, understanding that this was a British civil war that might offer opportunities but would likely bring new storms to their lands. As months passed, British forces evacuated Boston, finding the position untenable under American pressure and new artillery that Washington's army had laboriously hauled from captured forts in the interior. The war shifted to other theaters, especially around New York and in the South. Still, at this stage, the political status of the colonies remained in a strange limbo. They were fighting British troops under a continental banner, but they had not yet formally severed ties with the crown. Debates in Congress and in pamphlets grew sharper. Writers like Thomas Paine, in a widely read work calling for common sense, argued that it was absurd for a vast continent to be ruled by a small island across the sea. He attacked monarchy as an institution and urged Americans to seize the moment to create a republic resting on the rights of the people. His arguments resonated with many who had long thought of themselves as loyal Englishmen, but now saw that the logic of events and of their own principles pointed toward independence. The colonies now stood on the threshold between two worlds. One was the familiar, if now ruptured, imperial order in which they had grown from fragile settlements into complex societies. The other was an uncharted future in which they might declare themselves a new nation and try to defend that claim on battlefields and in diplomacy. The story of colonial America was drawing to a close, and the story of the United States was about to begin, with a declaration in Philadelphia that would turn a regional revolt into a revolution watched around the world.